Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval pottery workshop, and I promise you, this isn't the serene, Instagram-worthy experience you're imagining. Forget those satisfying videos of clay spinning smoothly on modern electric wheels while someone's perfectly manicured hands shape a symmetrical vase in 30 seconds. No, you're about to discover why medieval potters had the life expectancy of a soldier and hands that looked like they'd been put through a meat grinder. You can smell it before you even see it. That earthy, mineral tang of wet clay mixed with smoke and something else. Something organic and slightly rotten that you can't quite place. The workshop looms ahead in the pre-dawn darkness, and you're already regretting every life choice that led you here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little community spans the globe. Someone's having breakfast in Tokyo while someone else is winding down after work in Toronto. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 4 in the morning on a Tuesday in 1347, somewhere in the English Midlands. You've been apprenticed to Master William the Potter for exactly 3 days, and your body is already staging a full-scale rebellion. Your back feels like someone replaced your spine with a rusty iron rod. Your hands are covered in cuts that won't heal because they're constantly submerged in clay water, which, surprise, is mildly alkaline and essentially pickling your skin from the outside in. You haven't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch since you arrived, because the workshop operates on a schedule that would make a modern labor union representative weep into their coffee. You're stumbling through the dark now, following the dim glow of the workshop's fire pit. Medieval towns didn't have street lighting, obviously, so you're navigating by memory and the occasional shaft of moonlight. You nearly twist your ankle in a rut filled with what you desperately hope is just mud. The air is cold enough that you can see your breath, and you're wearing basically everything you own. A scratchy wool tunic, woolen hose that do almost nothing against the chill, and leather shoes that have already developed holes in the soles. Medieval people were cold pretty much all the time from October through April, but potters had it worse because they worked with water constantly, and wet plus cold equals misery. The workshop door creaks open. Medieval hinges were not known for their silence, and you're hit with a wall of slightly warmer air that somehow smells worse inside than outside. It's that clay smell again, intensified, mixed with stale sweat, wood ash, and the unmistakable scent of the communal chamber pot that hasn't been emptied in several days. Medieval people had a different relationship with smell than we do. They weren't nose-blind exactly, but they certainly had a higher tolerance for what we'd consider absolutely rank. You're going to develop that tolerance too, whether you want to or not. Master William is already there, of course. He's always there first. The man seems to require approximately 0 sleep, which you're beginning to suspect is some kind of dark sorcery. He's in his 40s, ancient by medieval standards where the average life expectancy for someone in a manual trade hovered around 45 if they were lucky. His hands are what you notice most. Gnarled, clay-stained, permanently gray under the fingernails, with calluses so thick they look like he's wearing gloves made of horn. One of his thumbnails is completely black, dead from some injury weeks ago. He doesn't even seem to notice it. Late again, he grunts, which is unfair because you're actually early by any reasonable standard. But in a medieval workshop, reasonable isn't a concept that exists. You mumble an apology and move toward the clay bins, but he stops you with a raised hand. Not today. Today you dig. Your heart sinks. You've heard the other apprentices talk about digging days with the kind of haunted look usually reserved for discussions of the plague. Digging means leaving the workshop and heading down to the riverbank to harvest raw clay, and it's apparently the absolute worst job in the entire pottery-making process. The senior apprentice, Thomas, a stick-thin 16-year-old who's been here for 3 years and looks about 30, shoots you a sympathetic glance that doesn't make you feel better at all. Master William hands you a wooden spade that's seen better decades. The handle is worn smooth in the middle from countless hands, and there's a crack running through it that's been inexpertly wrapped with leather cord. This thing is going to give you splinters, possibly break mid-dig, and definitely make your hands bleed. Medieval tools were not ergonomically designed because, well, no one had invented ergonomics yet. They made do with what they had, and what they had was usually half-broken and uncomfortable. River Bend, East Side, where the bank cuts deep, William instructs. Fill 4 baskets. Good clay, mind you, not that sandy rubbish from the shallow spots. You'll know it when you see it. This is medieval teaching methodology in a nutshell. Vague instructions, zero supervision, and the expectation that you'll figure it out through trial and error. Mostly error. If you mess up, you'll know because Master William will spend the next week reminding you of your incompetence in creative and demoralizing ways. You head out into the growing dawn with Thomas, who's been assigned to make sure you don't completely bungle this. The baskets you're carrying are woven willow, surprisingly well made actually, because basket weaving was a serious craft. But they're heavy even empty, and you're supposed to haul them back full of wet clay, which is going to weigh roughly as much as a medieval person. That's not hyperbole. A basket of wet clay could easily hit 80 to 100 pounds. The walk to the river takes 20 minutes through town. You pass the baker's shop where someone's already stoking the ovens. Bakers started their days even earlier than potters. Poor souls. The streets are starting to wake up. A couple of merchants opening shutters. A woman dumping something unspeakable from a second-story window that you barely dodge. A pack of feral dogs investigating garbage in an alley. Medieval towns were remarkably loud and busy once the sun came up. But right now, in this liminal pre-dawn space, everything feels suspended and slightly eerie. The riverbank is worse than you imagined. Much worse. The bank is less of a bank and more of a steep, muddy slope that looks like it actively wants to kill you. Thomas points to a spot where the earth is a different color. A deep, blue-gray that somehow looks wetter than the surrounding mud. There. That's the clay seam. Digs out nice and smooth if you do it right. He demonstrates, sinking the spade into the earth and levering out a chunk of clay that's almost black with moisture. You try to copy him. Your spade skids off the surface, barely scratching it. Thomas sighs. Put your weight into it, and mind you don't lose your footing, or you'll slide right into the river, and the current's stronger than it looks. Historians still argue whether medieval people were stronger than us on average. Some evidence suggests constant manual labor from childhood made them surprisingly robust, while other research points out that chronic malnutrition probably offset any strength gains. Either way, Thomas makes this look easy, and you're struggling. After 10 minutes of hacking at the clay face, you've managed to extract maybe 10 pounds of clay and you're sweating despite the cold. Your hands are already blistering. The spade handle definitely gave you splinters, and you're starting to understand why pottery wasn't considered a prestigious profession. This isn't skilled craft work. This is just brutal, grinding physical labor that destroys your body one shovelful at a time. Thomas is working steadily beside you, and you notice he's singing quietly under his breath. Some working song you don't recognize, the medieval equivalent of a podcast to make the time pass. Medieval workers sang constantly while they worked, partly to coordinate group efforts, but mostly because it made the horrible tedium slightly less horrible. You try to find your rhythm. Drive the spade in, lever back, lift the chunk of clay, dump it in the basket. Drive, lever, lift, dump. Your shoulders start burning after the first basket is half full. First time's always rough, Thomas offers, probably noticing that you look like you're about to collapse. Your body gets used to it. Mostly. He doesn't sound entirely convinced by his own reassurance. You're certainly not convinced. The basket is getting heavier with every addition, and you've still got 3.5 more to fill. The sun is fully up now, which should feel cheerful, but instead just makes you more aware of how much day is left ahead of you. Something moves in the clay face, something alive, and you yelp and jump back, nearly dropping your spade into the river. Thomas laughs, the first genuinely amused sound you've heard from him. Just a leech. They're all through the clay beds. Don't worry, they're not the biting kind. This is a lie. Medieval rivers were absolutely full of leeches, many of which definitely were the biting kind, and you're going to discover this firsthand in about 15 minutes when you notice one attached to your ankle. Fun fact, medieval doctors used leeches for bloodletting because they believed in balancing the body's humors. But finding one on you by accident in a freezing river is a completely different experience from clinical application. By the time you've filled 2 baskets, which takes nearly 2 hours, your hands are bleeding in at least 3 places, you've fallen onto your knees twice in the mud, and you're pretty sure you've pulled something in your lower back that's never going to fully heal. This is day 3 of your apprenticeship. You've got approximately 7 years to go before you're considered a journeyman. The math on that is genuinely depressing. Thomas hefts one of the full baskets experimentally and nods. Good clay. Master William will be pleased. You try to lift the other basket and nearly give yourself a hernia. The thing weighs more than you do after 3 days of medieval food portions. Thomas sees you struggling and doesn't offer to help. Another charming aspect of medieval pedagogy was that asking for help was seen as weakness, and showing weakness meant you'd get the worst jobs forever. So you grip the basket handles, bend your knees the way you vaguely remember from some corporate training about proper lifting technique, and haul the thing up. Your spine makes a noise it definitely shouldn't make. The walk back to the workshop is agony in slow motion. You have to stop every 50 feet to rest, and each time you pick the basket back up, it's somehow heavier than before. Thomas is ahead of you with his own basket, moving at a steady pace that suggests he's done this 1,000 times, which he has. You pass through the town again, and now it's fully awake and bustling. A group of children point at you and laugh because you're absolutely covered in mud and look like you've been wrestling a pig. Medieval people found physical comedy hilarious, and there was nothing funnier than watching an apprentice suffer through their training. Back at the workshop, Master William inspects your clay with the critical eye of someone whose livelihood depends on quality materials. He squeezes a handful, sniffs it, yes, sniffs it, and finally grunts approval. Acceptable. Now dump it in the pit and start treading. You look at Thomas, hoping this is some kind of medieval hazing joke. Thomas shakes his head slowly. It's not a joke. You're going to spend the rest of the morning stomping clay with your bare feet in a pit that looks like it hasn't been cleaned since the reign of King John. But that's a nightmare for future you, which will arrive in about 5 minutes. Present you gets to enjoy this brief moment of standing still, even though your legs are shaking and your back is screaming and you're starting to understand that medieval pottery wasn't a craft. It was a form of slow-motion torture that you paid for with your youth and health. And you haven't even touched an actual pottery wheel yet. That's tomorrow's fresh hell. Welcome to the Medieval Pottery Workshop. You're going to hate every single minute of it. The clay pit is exactly as awful as it looked from a distance. Actually, it's worse because distance mercifully obscured some of the finer details, like the fact that the clay is mixed with what appears to be the workshop's entire history of organic debris. You can see straw bits, something that might be animal hair, and several things you're choosing not to identify because ignorance is genuinely bliss in this situation. The pit itself is about 6 feet across and 2 feet deep, lined with wooden planks that have gone slimy with age and constant moisture. This is where raw clay gets processed, which is a generous term for what's about to happen to your feet and legs. Master William gestures impatiently toward the pit. In you go. Break up the lumps, work out the stones, tread it smooth. You'll know it's ready when it feels like butter. This comparison is supremely unhelpful because you've never encountered butter that weighs 40 pounds per cubic foot and has the consistency of cold cement, but you're learning not to ask clarifying questions. Medieval masters viewed questions as evidence that you weren't paying attention, even when they'd provided zero actual instruction. You unlace your shoes, those barely functional leather things that have already failed you multiple times today, and step into the pit. The clay is shockingly cold. Not just cold, but cold in that bone-deep way that makes you gasp involuntarily. It's November, remember, and this clay was just dug from a riverbank where the water temperature hovers somewhere between unpleasant and hypothermic. Your feet sinking up to mid-calf, and the sensation is like stepping into cold oatmeal mixed with gravel. Because there is gravel. Lots of it. That's what you're supposed to be working out. Thomas is already treading in the adjacent pit with the mechanical rhythm of someone who's done this so many times he can dissociate completely and let his body run on autopilot. Lift left foot, stomp, drag, lift right foot, stomp, drag. Over and over and over. He's humming again, a different tune this time, something vaguely liturgical that you think might be a hymn. Medieval workers were surprisingly devout, partly because the church was the center of social life, but mostly because when your job is this miserable, prayer feels like a reasonable response. You try to copy Thomas's rhythm. Left foot up, which requires genuinely shocking amounts of effort because the clay has suction. Stomp down, drag it forward to break up lumps. Right foot up. Oh God, your calf is already cramping. Stomp, drag. The clay is full of stones like Thomas mentioned, ranging from pebble size to chunks that are genuinely impressive. Each time your foot contacts one, you have to work it toward the edge of the pit where you can fish it out and toss it into a discard pile. Medieval potters were obsessive about removing stones, because even a tiny pebble left in the clay would create a weak point that could cause the finished pot to crack during firing. One small stone could ruin weeks of work. After 10 minutes of treading, your legs are burning. After 20 minutes, you're convinced you're going to collapse. After 30 minutes, you've entered a fugue state where time has lost all meaning and you're just a treading machine, a medieval clay processing unit running on suffering and the faint hope that this will eventually end. It doesn't end. You tread for what feels like hours, and when you finally look up to check the sun's position, only 45 minutes have passed. You want to cry, but crying would require energy you don't have. The other thing no one mentioned about treading clay is that it absolutely destroys your feet. The alkalinity in the clay, caused by natural mineral content and also probably the lime that medieval potters sometimes mixed in to improve plasticity, is turning your skin into something resembling a boiled chicken. Your feet are going from pink to red to an angry, splotchy white. Small cuts and scrapes that you didn't even know you had are now announcing themselves with stinging insistence. And your toenails are collecting clay underneath them in a way that's going to be absolutely disgusting when you finally get out of this pit. If you get out, you're starting to have doubts. Historians still argue whether medieval potters had higher rates of foot infections compared to other tradespeople, but anecdotal evidence from guild records suggests yes, absolutely they did. Trench foot wasn't just a World War I phenomenon. Medieval workers who spent hours in cold, wet conditions developed similar problems. You're well on your way to joining that unfortunate tradition. Your feet have gone from cold to numb to painful in a cycle that's now repeating every few minutes, and you're fairly certain you're doing permanent damage to your circulation. Master William appears at the edge of the pit to inspect your progress. He squints at the clay, pokes it with a stick, because apparently he's not willing to touch it himself, which should tell you something, and frowns. Still lumpy. Another hour at least. Another hour. You might actually die. Thomas catches your eye and gives you a look that communicates perfect understanding and zero sympathy. He's suffered through this exact experience, and now it's your turn. This is the medieval apprenticeship system in its purest form. Ritualized hazing dressed up as training. The thing about repetitive physical labor is that your mind starts to wander in strange directions. You're treading clay, but you're also thinking about the fact that somewhere in this town, there are nobles eating roasted peacock and drinking imported wine while you're standing ankle-deep in cold mud. The medieval class system wasn't subtle. Potters were considered lower-tier craftspeople, not as low as tanners or dung collectors, but definitely not as respected as goldsmiths or stonemasons. You made chamber pots, cooking vessels, and storage jars. Necessary stuff, sure, but not glamorous. No one wrote songs about the brave and noble potter. Your left calf seizes up completely. Not just a cramp, a full muscle lockup that makes your leg rigid and sends shooting pain up to your hip. You yelp and grab the edge of the pit, trying not to collapse into the clay. Thomas glances over. Happens to everyone. Breathe through it. Breathe through it. Medieval medical advice was consistently unhelpful because medieval understanding of physiology was based on the theory of humors and the influence of planetary alignments. They thought muscle cramps were caused by an imbalance of cold and dry humors, which no, it's actually because you've been standing in one position making repetitive motions for an hour and your muscles are staging a rebellion. You manage to straighten your leg through sheer force of will and a lot of whimpering. The cramp releases slowly, leaving behind a deep ache that you know is going to haunt you for days. But you can't stop treading because Master William is watching from the workshop doorway, and stopping means you're weak, and being weak means you'll get the worst jobs until you prove yourself, which you can't do if you're stuck in the clay pit forever. It's a perfect circle of medieval logic. The clay is slowly, infinitesimally, beginning to transform under your feet. The lumps are breaking down, the texture is becoming more uniform, and the stones are mostly worked out. You can feel the difference. It's becoming smoother, more plastic, easier to move through. This is actually the important skill you're supposed to be learning here: how to recognize good clay by feel. Medieval potters didn't have laboratory testing or standardized materials. They learned through their hands and feet what clay was ready to throw and what needed more work. It's a genuine skill, even though the process of acquiring it is torture. A quirky fact that might distract you from your suffering: medieval potters sometimes added crushed pottery shards, called grog, to their clay to change its working properties. Grog reduced shrinkage during drying and made the clay more resistant to thermal shock during firing. So potters would smash their failed pieces, grind them to powder, and mix them back into new clay. It's actually very sensible recycling, and the practice continued well into the industrial age. The clay you're treading right now almost certainly contains the crushed remnants of pots that failed last month. You're literally standing on pulverized disappointment. The sun has moved considerably by the time Master William finally declares your clay ready. You've been treading for nearly 2 hours, though it feels like you've aged a decade. Your legs are shaking uncontrollably as you try to climb out of the pit, and you nearly faceplant into the workshop floor. Thomas catches your arm, a rare moment of solidarity, and helps you to a bench. Your feet are completely white and wrinkled, like you've spent a day in a bathtub, except bathtubs were warm and pleasant and this was cold and hellish. Don't sit long, Thomas warns. Got to keep moving or you'll seize up complete. This is actually good advice. Medieval workers understood that sitting down immediately after intense physical labor made everything worse, even if they didn't understand the physiology behind it. You force yourself to stand and hobble around the workshop, trying to restore feeling to your legs. The workshop itself is a relatively large space, maybe 30 feet by 20, with a packed earth floor, timber walls, and a roof that's seen better years. There are holes in the thatching that admit shafts of dusty sunlight, and you can see where someone has attempted repairs with fresh straw that doesn't quite match. The walls are lined with shelves holding pots in various stages of completion. There are storage jars, cooking pots, jugs, bowls, and chamber pots, lots of chamber pots, because medieval people needed somewhere to pee at night and chamber pots were a consistent seller. Some of the pieces are plain, utilitarian works that prioritize function over form. Others have been decorated with simple incised patterns or a coating of slip, a liquid clay mixture, that will fire to a different color than the body clay. Medieval pottery wasn't generally fancy, but potters took pride in their work and added flourishes when they could. In the corner sits the pottery wheel, and just looking at it makes your legs hurt worse. That's a kick wheel, the medieval standard, which requires you to kick a heavy stone or wooden flywheel to maintain momentum while simultaneously trying to center and shape clay on the wheel head above. It's like trying to pat your head and rub your stomach while also doing squats. You'll be attempting this tomorrow, and you're already dreading it. Master William assigns you to wedging next, which sounds innocuous but is actually another brutal upper body workout. Wedging is the process of kneading clay to remove air bubbles and ensure uniform consistency. Air bubbles in clay are deadly. They expand during firing and can cause pots to explode in the kiln, destroying not just that piece but potentially everything around it. So you take a lump of clay, slam it onto a wooden table, fold it over, slam it again, fold, slam, slam, over and over, until your shoulders are screaming and your hands are cramping and you're starting to understand that pottery is just finding new and creative ways to make your body hurt. Thomas demonstrates the technique, his movements sufficient and practiced. Spiral wedging, he explains, showing you how to rotate the clay as you fold it, creating a spiral pattern inside that ensures even mixing. Count your wedges. 50 times minimum for throwing clay, 100 times for fine work. You try to copy him. Your first slam sends clay squirting out sideways and nearly hits Master William, who gives you a look that could curdle milk. Your second slam lands off-center and nearly breaks your thumb. This is fine. Everything is fine. By the time you've wedged your assigned lumps, and Master William assigns you extra because your first attempts were sloppy, it's midday and you're more exhausted than you've ever been in your life. Medieval workers didn't get lunch breaks in the modern sense. You got a brief pause to eat whatever you'd brought, usually bread, maybe some cheese if you were lucky, possibly an onion if you were really living large. You sit on the floor because there aren't enough benches and gnaw on a piece of dark bread that's dense enough to be used as a building material. It's made from mixed grains, rye, barley, maybe some wheat if the harvest was good. And it's not terrible, just profoundly boring. Medieval lower-class diet was mainly characterized by its relentless lack of variety. Thomas sits next to you and produces his own lunch. Bread and a small piece of salt pork that looks like leather. Gets easier, he says, though his tone suggests he doesn't entirely believe this. After the first month, your body adjusts. Mostly. You're noticing he qualifies everything with mostly, which isn't reassuring. You ask him how long he plans to stay with Master William. He shrugs. Till I'm 20, maybe. Then journeyman work if I can get it. Guild won't let you set up your own shop till you're 25 and can prove you've got the coin and the skills. The medieval guild system was essentially a professional mafia that controlled who could work in each trade, what they could charge, and how they could operate. You couldn't just decide to be a potter and open a shop. You had to apprentice for years, work as a journeyman for more years, submit a masterpiece, an example of your best work, to the guild for approval, and pay substantial fees for the privilege of setting up independently. Most people never made it that far. They worked as journeymen their whole lives, or they stayed with their master's workshop, or they gave up and found different work. The pottery profession had a high washout rate because the work was brutal and the financial rewards were modest at best. You finish your bread and realize you're desperately thirsty. There's a bucket of water in the corner that everyone drinks from using a shared ladle. The water is brownish and has things floating in it. Medieval water quality was what we'd now consider undrinkable, though people didn't understand germ theory, so they just drank it and got sick a lot. You're going to drink from that bucket because you're dehydrated from 2 hours of treading clay, and you're going to try not to think about where the water came from or what those floating bits are. The water tastes like clay and disappointment. Master William is back, which means lunch is over. Glaze grinding, he announces, pointing you toward a corner where there's a large stone mortar and pestle along with several bags of mysterious substances. Glaze was the medieval potter's secret weapon, a glass coating that made pottery waterproof and more durable. But medieval glaze wasn't something you bought pre-mixed. You made it yourself by grinding various minerals and oxides to powder, then mixing them with water. The most common glaze was lead-based, which, fun fact, is actively poisonous and caused chronic health problems for potters who worked with it for years. You're handed a bag of galena, which is lead sulfide ore, and told to grind it to a fine powder. The mortar and pestle are both stone, heavy and cold. You pour some galena chunks into the mortar, they're silvery gray and surprisingly pretty, and start grinding. The chunks break down slowly, reluctantly, producing a powder that's dull gray and probably full of lead particles that you're now breathing. Medieval potters had no concept of protective equipment. No masks, no gloves, no ventilation systems. You just ground your toxic minerals and hoped for the best. The grinding is monotonous work that gives you time to reflect on your life choices. Your hands are already blistered from digging clay this morning, and now the grinding motion is irritating those blisters into open sores. Your back hurts from treading. Your legs are still shaky. Your feet look like they've been boiled. And you're breathing lead dust in a poorly ventilated workshop while grinding minerals for a glaze that will eventually make someone's cooking pot slightly shinier. This is day 3. You have 7 years ahead of you. Historians still argue whether medieval craftspeople were generally satisfied with their work or if most of them dreamed of escape. The written records are sparse because potters weren't usually literate and didn't leave diaries. But the high turnover rate in apprenticeships suggests that a lot of people tried pottery work and decided pretty quickly that it wasn't for them. You're starting to understand why. This isn't the romantic medieval workshop of fantasy novels. This is just hard, repetitive, dangerous labor that pays poorly and destroys your body one day at a time. You grind galena until your arms feel like they're going to fall off, and then you grind some more because Master William keeps checking your powder and declaring it not fine enough. Medieval standards for fine powder were apparently set somewhere between talcum powder and fairy dust. By the time he's satisfied, it's mid-afternoon and you've produced maybe 2 pounds of lead glaze base. This will be mixed with other ingredients, ash for flux, sometimes clay for suspension, maybe some copper oxide if someone wants green glaze, but that's advanced work. You're just the grinding monkey. The rest of the afternoon blurs into a series of small miseries. You haul water from the well. You stack firewood near the kiln. You sweep the floor, which is pointless because it's literally made of dirt and will be just as dirty in 5 minutes. You do whatever Master William tells you to do, moving through the workshop in a haze of exhaustion and mounting despair. By the time the sun starts setting, around 4:30 in November, because medieval England was very far north and winter days were depressingly short, you're so tired you can barely stand. Thomas shows you where you'll be sleeping. A corner of the workshop with some straw and a thin wool blanket. Medieval apprentices didn't get separate housing. You slept where you worked, ate where you worked, and basically existed where you worked. Privacy wasn't a concept. The straw looks like it hasn't been changed in months and probably contains livestock. The blanket has patches and holes and smells like old sweat. This is your bed now. You collapse onto the straw without even taking off your clay-covered clothes. Your body is one continuous ache from scalp to toes. Your hands throb. Your feet are probably permanently damaged. And tomorrow you're going to wake up at 4 in the morning and do this all over again. Except tomorrow you're supposed to learn the pottery wheel, which everyone says is even harder than treading clay. You close your eyes and try to remember why you thought learning a medieval trade would be a good idea. You can't. The reason is gone, dissolved in clay water and crushed under the weight of this impossible day. Outside, you can hear the town settling in for night. Someone's playing a pipe badly. A dog barks. Voices rise and fall in conversation you can't quite make out. And somewhere in the workshop, Master William is working late by candlelight, because of course he is, putting final touches on pots that will be fired later this week. The man never stops. You're beginning to suspect that's what it takes to survive in this profession. An absolute refusal to acknowledge your body's limitations, a willingness to work yourself into an early grave for the sake of making functional pottery that will be used and broken and forgotten. Welcome to medieval pottery. You're not going to make it. You wake up to someone kicking your feet, which is a terrible way to start any day, but especially terrible when those feet are covered in half-healed blisters and possibly frostbite. Is Thomas, looking apologetic but also completely unsympathetic because he's been through this exact experience and knows that sympathy doesn't actually help. Master's already up. We'll work today. He says this like it's supposed to motivate you, but all you feel is a deep, existential dread that starts in your stomach and radiates outward to your extremities. Your body has staged a complete revolt overnight. Every muscle you own is screaming. Your hands have locked into claw shapes from yesterday's grinding work and won't fully straighten. Your back feels like someone spent the night using it as a xylophone with a hammer. And when you try to stand, your legs wobble so badly that you have to grab the wall for support. This is day 4. Medieval people who survived apprenticeships must have been made of something fundamentally different than modern humans, or possibly they were just too stubborn to admit defeat. You're leaning toward the stubborn theory. The workshop is freezing, actually freezing, as in there's frost on the inside of the walls where condensation has crystallized overnight. Medieval buildings had essentially zero insulation. You had timber frames, wattle and daub walls that were mostly mud and straw, and hope. That was your defense against November in England. Master William has already started a fire in the central hearth, but it's doing almost nothing against the cold except creating a 3-foot radius of slightly less freezing air. You stumble toward it and nearly walk into a rack of unfired pots that someone, probably you yesterday when you were too exhausted to remember, left in a stupid place. Breakfast is more bread, this time with a scraping of butter that's more memory than substance. Medieval lower-class people ate a lot of bread. Breakfast was bread, lunch was bread, dinner was bread with maybe some pottage, a vegetable stew that was basically whatever you could throw in a pot. Meat was a luxury for special occasions. You gnaw your bread and try to mentally prepare for will work, which you've been dreading since you learned it was coming. The pottery wheel sits in the corner like a medieval torture device, which isn't far from the truth. It's a kick wheel, the standard design that dominated pottery production for centuries. There's a heavy wooden or stone flywheel at floor level, connected by a vertical shaft to a smaller wheel head at waist height. The concept is simple. You kick the flywheel to spin it, that momentum transfers to the wheel head, and you shape clay while it's spinning. In practice, it requires coordinating your legs, your hands, your body position, and your breathing while also somehow centering a lump of clay that really doesn't want to be centered. It's like trying to juggle while riding a unicycle while also doing calculus in your head. Master William plops a lump of wedged clay on the wheel head, about 5 pounds, which doesn't sound like much until you're trying to control it while it's spinning at 60 rotations per minute. Center it first, he instructs, demonstrating with his own wheel. His leg starts pumping rhythmically, the flywheel spins, and his hands move to the clay with the confidence of someone who's done this 10,000 times. The clay, which started as a lumpy off-center mass, somehow transforms into a perfect cone rising from the wheel, then gets pressed down into a centered disc. The whole process takes maybe 30 seconds. He makes it look like breathing. Your turn. He steps back and gestures at your wheel. You approach it like it might bite, which feels appropriate because this thing is absolutely going to hurt you. You start kicking. The flywheel is heavy, probably 60 or 70 pounds, and getting it up to speed requires serious leg power. Your right leg is already burning after 10 kicks, and the wheel is barely spinning. Thomas, working at his own will nearby, calls over, harder, faster. You need momentum. You kick harder. Your thigh muscles, still traumatized from yesterday's clay treading, scream in protest. The wheel is finally spinning at something approaching the right speed, which means now you have to actually touch the clay while keeping the wheel going. This is the part where medieval pottery becomes a full-body coordination nightmare. You wet your hands in the water bucket. Pottery requires constant water to keep the clay slippery, and press them against the spinning lump. The clay immediately fights back, wobbling violently and threatening to fly off the wheel entirely. You instinctively pull your hands away, which makes the wobble worse. "Brace your elbows on your thighs," Master William says, which would have been useful information before you started. "Lock your body. The clay moves, you don't." You try this, wedging your elbows against your legs and creating a stable triangle between your hands, arms, and core. It helps slightly. The clay is still wobbling, but at least it's not about to achieve escape velocity. You squeeze inward with your hands, trying to force the clay toward the center. It resists with surprising force. Clay spinning on a wheel generates significant centrifugal force, and fighting that force with just your hand strength is brutally difficult. Historians still argue whether medieval potters developed specific muscle groups from wheel work that would be visible in skeletal remains. Some research suggests that asymmetrical muscle development in the right leg and forearms might indicate a professional potter, but the evidence is ambiguous. What's not ambiguous is that your body is going to change if you keep doing this work. Your right leg is going to become significantly stronger than your left. Your forearms are going to develop grip strength that borders on superhuman. And your back is going to develop a permanent curve from hunching over a pottery wheel for 8 hours a day. The clay is slowly, grudgingly beginning to center. You can feel the wobble decreasing as the mass runs true. It's actually working. You're doing it. And then your leg cramps completely. The wheel slows and the clay, sensing weakness like a predator, immediately goes off-center again and collapses into an asymmetric blob. Master William sighs the sigh of a man who has witnessed this exact failure countless times. Again, you kick the wheel back up to speed, which takes forever because your leg is cramping and your thigh muscle is twitching involuntarily. The second attempt goes about the same as the first, brief success followed by catastrophic failure when some part of your body gives out. The third attempt, you actually manage to hold the center for almost a minute before the wheel slows too much and everything goes wrong. This is progress, technically. It's also agonizing. Medieval apprentices typically spent weeks or even months just learning to center clay before they were allowed to actually throw a pot. Centering is the foundational skill. If you can't center, everything that comes after is impossible. Master William clearly expects you to spend most of today just centering and recentering the same lump of clay over and over until muscle memory begins to form. It's mind-numbingly repetitive work that would be boring if it wasn't also physically exhausting and technically demanding. You center and lose it, center and lose it, center and lose it. The rhythm becomes hypnotic after a while. Kick, kick, kick to build speed. Wet your hands. Press inward. Squeeze up into a cone to align the clay particles. A trick that medieval potters figured out empirically without understanding the material science behind it. Press the cone down into a disc. Feel for the wobble. Adjust pressure. And just when you think you've got it, something fails, your leg, your concentration, your hand position, and you're back to a wobbling lump. Thomas glances over between throwing his own pots. He's making simple bowls with practiced efficiency and offers advice. Stop fighting it. The clay wants to center. You're just guiding it. This is very zen and also completely unhelpful because the clay absolutely does not want to center. The clay wants to fly off the wheel and splatter against the wall. You're in a battle of wills with an inanimate substance, and the substance is winning. A quirky detail about medieval pottery wheels. The flywheel weight was often customized to the potter's preference and leg strength. Heavier flywheels maintained momentum longer but required more effort to get spinning. Lighter flywheels were easier to start but needed constant kicking to maintain speed. Master Williams will has a massive stone flywheel that probably weighs close to 100 pounds. Your training will has a lighter wooden one, but it's still heavy enough to make your leg shake after an hour of kicking. Some workshops had apprentices sharing wheels, taking turns kicking to maintain momentum while the master threw pots, which sounds like a special kind of torture. By mid-morning, your right leg is completely destroyed. The muscle is cramping continuously, twitching in weird patterns, and occasionally just giving out entirely. Your hands are raw from the combination of water, clay, and friction. The skin on your palms is starting to slough off in wet sheets, which is absolutely disgusting and also apparently normal. Thomas shows you his own hands, which are covered in thick calluses that look like armor plating. Takes about 6 months before your hands toughen up proper, he says cheerfully. 6 months. You might not have 6 months in you. Master William finally lets you attempt to actually throw a pot after you've successfully centered clay 3 times in a row without losing it. Simple bowl, he instructs. Open the center, pull up the walls. Don't get fancy. He demonstrates again, his hands moving through the steps with fluid precision. Opening the center. Fingers press down into the middle of the center disc, creating a depression while keeping the bottom thick enough that you don't punch through. Pulling up the walls. Fingers inside and outside, squeezing gently and pulling upward, gradually thinning the clay and raising the sides. You try to open the center. Your fingers sink into the clay, which feels oddly intimate and also slightly disturbing. The spinning clay is warm from friction, smooth, and responsive. You press down, feeling for the wheelhead beneath. Too deep, Master William makes a warning noise. You've almost punched through the bottom. You ease up, leaving a floor that's probably too thick but at least intact. Now for the walls. This is where everything goes comprehensively wrong. You position your fingers like Master William showed you. Right hand inside, left hand outside, meeting at the base of the wall. You start to pull upward while squeezing gently. The clay immediately thins unevenly, creating a wobbling wall that gets thinner on one side than the other. You try to correct, pressing harder on the thin side. The thin side tears. Water sprays everywhere. The bowl collapses inward like a failed soufflé. Your first pot is dead. Again, Master William's favorite word. He slaps another lump of clay on your wheelhead. You go through the centering process again, easier this time because your muscles are starting to remember the motions, and attempt another bowl. This one gets slightly further before disaster strikes. You've pulled the walls up maybe 3 inches when your leg cramps, the wheel slows, and the rim warps into something resembling a potato chip. Dead bowl number 2. Medieval potters had a term for the learning process: paying your clay dues. Every failed pot represented wasted material, wasted time, and wasted kiln space. Apprentices were expected to fail constantly in the early months. It was part of training, but those failures had to be recycled. Your collapsed bowls get thrown back into the wedging pile to be reworked later. Nothing was wasted in a medieval workshop because materials cost money and profit margins were razor thin. Bowl attempt 3, you actually complete something bowl-shaped. It's lumpy, asymmetric, with walls that vary in thickness from paper thin to bunker wall thick, and the rim wobbles like a drunk person trying to walk a straight line. But it's technically a bowl. Master William inspects it with the expression of someone examining a dead fish. Better, he finally admits, which is probably the most praise you're going to get today. Set it to dry. Make another. The process repeats for hours. Make a bowl, set it to dry, make another bowl. Your success rate is maybe 1 in 4. Most attempts end in collapse, tearing, or just general deformation that makes them unusable. The successful ones aren't good, but they're complete, which counts for something. Each bowl takes you about 15 minutes, which is glacially slow compared to Thomas, who can throw a basic bowl in 3 or 4 minutes. Speed comes with practice, and you have almost no practice. The physical toll of will work is different from clay treading, but equally brutal. Your right leg is doing all the kicking work, leading to a weird imbalanced exhaustion where one leg is shaking and cramping while the other is relatively fine. Your back is locked in a hunched position, bent over the wheel to get your hands in proper position. Your shoulders are tense from trying to keep your arms steady, and your neck is cramped from looking down at the wheel head for hours without moving. Around midday, Master William calls a break. You basically collapse where you're standing, which turns out to be a mistake because getting back up requires effort you don't have. Thomas helps you to a bench and hands you your lunch bread. Your hands are shaking too badly to hold it properly, so you end up gnawing directly from the loaf like some kind of medieval beaver. Nobody comments on this because everyone's too tired to care about table manners. "How many bowls did you finish?" Thomas asks. You count mentally. 6, maybe 7 if that last one doesn't crack during drying. Thomas nods. "Not bad for first day on the wheel. I finished maybe 3 my first day." This is either a kind lie or Thomas was genuinely terrible at will work initially. Either way, it makes you feel slightly less incompetent, which is probably the point. The afternoon brings more will work, but with a twist. Master William wants you to try making a jug. Jugs are more complex than bowls because they require throwing a narrower form with a thicker rim for attaching a handle later. You watch him demonstrate. Center the clay, open it, pull up the walls, but instead of leaving them wide like a bowl, you gradually collar them inward to create a narrow neck. His hands move in coordinated patterns that look almost like dancing. The jug emerges from the spinning clay like magic. Your attempt is predictably disastrous. You center the clay fine, that skill is starting to stick, and open it fine. But when you try to collar the neck inward, you apply uneven pressure and the whole thing goes asymmetric. You try to correct, the clay gets too wet, the walls start to collapse, and within 30 seconds you're looking at an abstract sculpture that bears no resemblance to a jug. Master William doesn't even comment. He just gestures at you to try again. Attempt 2. The neck collapses inward so much it nearly closes completely. Attempt 3. The rim tears because you've overworked the clay. Attempt 4. You actually create something jug-shaped, but it's so lumpy and distorted that it looks like a jug that's melting. Still, it's complete, and you're absurdly proud of this ugly little vessel. Master William squints at it, turning it to examine all angles. Adequate. With a handle and glaze, it might sell. This is high praise, relatively speaking. You spend the rest of the afternoon throwing more jugs, improving incrementally with each attempt. By the time the light starts failing, which happens depressingly early in November, you've completed 3 jugs that Master William deems saleable and about a dozen failures that get recycled. Your body is absolutely ruined. Your leg won't stop twitching. Your hands are hamburger. Your back feels like someone's driven a stake through your spine. But you've learned to throw basic forms on a pottery wheel, which is actually a significant achievement even if it doesn't feel like one right now. Thomas shows you how to cut your finished pots off the wheel head using a wire, basically a length of twisted cord held taut between 2 wooden handles. You slide the wire under the pot and pull it through, separating the base from the wheel head with a satisfying wet sound. The pots then go onto wooden drying boards where they'll sit for several days, slowly losing moisture until they're leather hard, firm enough to handle but still soft enough to trim and add handles. The evening routine is becoming familiar. Sweep the workshop floor pointlessly, bank the fire, eat a small dinner of bread and whatever Master William's wife sends over from their house next door. Tonight it's turnips boiled into submission, which sounds awful and tastes worse, but you're too hungry to care. Medieval vegetables were generally smaller, tougher, and more bitter than modern varieties because centuries of selective breeding hadn't happened yet. You ate what you could grow and you were grateful for it. You collapse into your straw pile bed completely shattered. Your body has moved beyond pain into a state of total numbness where everything hurts equally and you've stopped bothering to track individual complaints. Thomas is already snoring in his corner. Master William is still working by candlelight. The man truly never stops, putting handles on jugs that were thrown yesterday. You watch him work for a few minutes, rolling out a clay coil for the handle, scoring the attachment points on the jug with a knife, pressing the handle into place with perfect confidence. This is your life now. Wake up at 4, work until dark, collapse, repeat. The pottery wheel has replaced the clay pit as your primary tormentor. But the overall experience of medieval pottery work remains consistently awful. Your body is being systematically destroyed by repetitive motions and impossible demands. Your hands will never be soft again. Your leg is developing muscles you didn't know existed. And you're beginning to understand that pottery wasn't a romantic craft practiced by gentle artists. It was brutal manual labor performed by people tough enough to survive it. Remember that clay pit from yesterday morning? That awful, cold, stone-filled nightmare? You miss it now because at least treading clay used both legs equally. The pottery wheel is creating a weird asymmetric body horror where your right side is significantly more developed than your left. Medieval potters probably walked with a distinctive gait from the muscular imbalance. You're well on your way to joining that limping tradition. Tomorrow, Master William promises you'll learn glazing and kiln loading. Tonight, you're too tired to dread it. You close your eyes and immediately fall into a dreamless sleep, your consciousness fleeing from the memory of today as fast as it can manage. Morning arrives with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, which is to say Thomas is shaking you awake and your body is filing formal complaints from every joint and muscle simultaneously. Day 5. You've been at this for less than a week and you already feel like you've aged 20 years. Your right leg, the kicking leg, is so sore that putting weight on it sends sharp pains shooting from your hip to your ankle. This is your life now. A progressive catalog of injuries and discomforts that accumulate faster than they heal. The workshop is somehow colder than yesterday, which seems physically impossible, but here you are, breathing out clouds of vapor and watching frost patterns on the inside walls. Master William has the fire going, but November in England doesn't care about your small defiant flame. The cold seeps into everything, the clay, the tools, your bones. Medieval people were just constantly cold for half the year, and they dealt with it by wearing every piece of clothing they owned simultaneously and moving as close to fires as possible without actually catching themselves aflame. Breakfast is the usual bread situation, but today there's a piece of cheese that's more rind than cheese and has developed interesting colors that probably shouldn't exist in nature. You eat it anyway because calories are calories, and you're burning through them at an alarming rate. Medieval lower-class people were often perpetually on the edge of hunger. Not starving exactly, but never quite full either. You're eating more than you ever did in your modern life, and you're still constantly hungry because the physical labor is relentless. Today's agenda, according to Master William's morning grunt, involves glazing and preparing for the next kiln firing. This sounds less physically demanding than will work or clay treading, and you feel a tiny flicker of hope that maybe today will be slightly less torturous. This hope is immediately crushed when you see the pile of leather-hard pots that need trimming first. Trimming is the process of refining pots after they've dried partially, shaving off excess clay from the base, smoothing out lumps, and generally making them less terrible looking. The trimming tools are simple. Wire loops mounted on wooden handles, basically medieval lathe tools operated by hand. You center a leather-hard bowl on the wheel, which doesn't require kicking because you're not throwing, just rotating slowly by hand, and carefully shave away clay from the base. The goal is to create a foot ring that the pot can sit on stably. This requires a delicate touch because leather-hard clay is unforgiving. Press too hard and you gouge through the wall. Too light and you accomplish nothing. The pressure has to be exactly right. Your first attempt results in a bowl with a lopsided foot ring that would make the pot wobble like it's perpetually drunk. Master William picks it up, examines it with his perpetual frown, and sets it aside. Practice piece. Try again. Practice piece is medieval workshop code for, "This is garbage, but we'll use it for something eventually." Maybe grinding it up for grog, maybe as a test piece in the kiln. The medieval waste-nothing mentality meant even your failures had purpose, which is either comforting or depressing depending on your perspective. You trim for 2 hours, slowly developing a feel for the right pressure and angle. The leather-hard clay produces curling ribbons as you shave it away, and there's something genuinely satisfying about creating a clean foot ring that's actually centered and level. Your success rate improves from maybe 1 in 5 to about 1 in 3, which Master William declares adequate progress. This is practically a standing ovation by his standards. Thomas is working nearby, trimming his own pots with practiced efficiency. He's also chatting, which is unusual because normally everyone's too tired or focused to talk much. Master's planning a firing for 3 days hence, he mentions. Big one. Probably 200 pieces if we can load it right. 200 pieces. That's days of work represented in a single firing, and if something goes wrong, if the kiln collapses or the temperature gets too high, or any of a dozen other disasters strikes, all of it is lost. Medieval pottery was a high-stakes gamble every time you open the kiln. The conversation turns to kiln disasters, because apparently this is what medieval pottery apprentices talk about for entertainment. Thomas tells you about the time the kiln collapsed mid-firing 2 years ago, destroying 3 weeks of work and nearly killing the apprentice who was feeding wood at the time. Another story involves a potter in the next town whose kiln exploded. Literally exploded, because he'd stacked it too densely and the moisture had nowhere to escape. The kiln burst apart like a clay bomb, sending shards of pottery through his workshop and embedding fragments in the timber walls. He survived but lost an eye and his livelihood. These stories are presumably meant to prepare you for the realities of kiln work, but mostly they're just terrifying. You're starting to understand that medieval pottery wasn't just physically demanding, it was actively dangerous. Clay dust in your lungs, lead poisoning from glazes, burns from the kiln, crushed limbs from moving heavy equipment, plus all the usual medieval hazards like infections that turn deadly because antibiotics won't be invented for another 600 years. The life expectancy for potters was notably lower than even the already depressing medieval average. Historians still argue whether medieval craftspeople had higher rates of specific diseases compared to the general population. Skeletal remains suggest that potters might have had more respiratory issues, probably from inhaling clay dust and kiln smoke for years, and higher rates of repetitive stress injuries. But the data is limited because most medieval potters weren't important enough to warrant detailed burial records. They lived, worked, died, and were forgotten, leaving behind only their pots and occasionally their bones. By midday, you've trimmed about 30 pieces, a mix of bowls, jugs, and storage jars. Your hands are cramping from gripping the trimming tools, and you've developed a new blister on your thumb where the tool handle rubs. The blister immediately breaks because your hands are constantly wet with clay water, and now you have a raw spot that stings with every movement. Medieval apprentices didn't have band-aids or antibiotic ointment. You just wrapped it with a scrap of cloth if you were fancy, or more likely you ignored it and hoped it didn't get infected. After the midday bread break, accompanied today by an onion that makes your eyes water just from proximity, Master William introduces you to glazing. The glaze materials are stored in small barrels. Ground galena that you helped prepare, wood ash from the kiln, various metal oxides for color, and clay for suspension. Master William demonstrates the mixing process, combining ingredients in specific ratios that he's worked out through years of trial and error. Medieval potters didn't have chemical formulas or firing charts. They had recipes passed down through apprenticeship, often jealously guarded trade secrets. The glaze mixing happens in a large wooden trough. William pours in the ground galena, adds water, then ash, then more water, stirring constantly with a wooden paddle. The mixture is thick and gray, with a slightly metallic sheen from the lead. Consistency matters, he explains, letting the glaze drip from the paddle. Too thick and it'll crawl during firing. Too thin and you get bare spots. He adds a handful of something brown, ochre maybe, or iron oxide, and the glaze shifts to a warmer tone. This will fire to a yellow-brown color, the standard cheap glaze for utilitarian pottery. You're handed a pot to glaze, one of the bowls you threw yesterday that somehow survived drying without cracking. The glazing method is deceptively simple. Dip the pot in the glaze bucket, hold it for a count of 3, pull it out, shake off excess, set it aside to dry. In practice, it's easy to mess up. Dip too long and the glaze is too thick. Too short and it's too thin. Hold it at the wrong angle and you get drips and runs. Don't shake it properly and you get fat spots that will blister during firing. Your first attempt produces a bowl with glaze that's absurdly uneven, thick on one side, thin on the other, with visible finger marks where you gripped it. Master William makes a disgusted noise. Wipe it off, try again. You can wipe unfired glaze off with a wet sponge and re-dip, but it's wasteful and time-consuming. You wipe carefully, getting most of the glaze off but leaving the bowl damp and slightly gray. Second attempt, better but still not great. The glaze coverage is more even, but you've got a drip on the rim that's going to fire thick and possibly fuse the bowl to whatever it's sitting on in the kiln. Thomas demonstrates proper technique. Grip the bowl by the foot ring, dip in one smooth motion, count silently, pull out, give it one sharp shake to shed excess, then gently tap the foot ring on the edge of the bucket to remove the drip that always forms there. Set it down on a clean board. The whole process takes maybe 10 seconds, and his glazed bowl looks professionally even. You try to copy his motions. Your bowl looks less terrible than the first 2 attempts, which counts as progress. The glazing continues for hours. Bowl after bowl, jug after jug, each one dipped in the gray lead glaze and set aside to dry. The glaze bucket is slowly depleting, and Master William mixes a fresh batch midway through the afternoon. You're getting better at the dipping motion, developing muscle memory for the right angle and timing. But you're also developing a headache from the lead fumes because yes, wet lead glaze produces vapors, and yes, you're breathing them in an enclosed workspace with minimal ventilation. Medieval potters absolutely suffered from chronic lead poisoning, though they didn't understand what was causing their symptoms. Lead poisoning presents as fatigue, headaches, abdominal pain, cognitive difficulties, and eventually neurological damage if exposure continues long enough. Medieval potters probably attributed these symptoms to bad humors or God's will or just the general misery of existence. They definitely didn't connect it to the glaze they worked with daily. Modern analysis of medieval potter skeletal remains shows elevated lead levels in the bones, confirming what we'd expect. These people were being slowly poisoned by their profession. A quirky detail about medieval lead glaze. It was incredibly popular despite the dangers because it was cheap, relatively easy to make, and produced a nice glossy finish that made pottery waterproof. Alternative glazes existed: salt glaze, alkaline glaze, tin glaze, but they were more expensive or required higher firing temperatures that small workshops couldn't reliably achieve. So lead glaze dominated the medieval pottery market, and potters just accepted the health consequences as part of the job. You're accepting them too right now, as your headache intensifies and you feel slightly nauseous from the fumes. By late afternoon, you've glazed about 50 pieces. Your hands are gray with dried glaze that's cracking and flaking off your skin. Your headache is persistent and throbbing. Your back hurts from bending over the glaze bucket for hours. And you're developing a new appreciation for just how many steps are involved in making a simple pot. Digging clay, treading it, wedging it, throwing it, trimming it, glazing it, and you still haven't even gotten to the firing stage where everything can still go catastrophically wrong. Master William declares the glazing complete for today and shifts focus to kiln preparation. The kiln is a large beehive-shaped structure outside the workshop, maybe 10 feet in diameter at the base, tapering to a chimney at the top. It's built from brick and clay, with a firebox at the bottom and a loading chamber above. The whole thing looks like it's held together by prayer and medieval engineering optimism. There are visible cracks in the walls that have been patched with clay. The floor inside is covered with pottery shards and ash from the last firing. Kiln loading is apparently an art form unto itself. Master William explains while gesturing at the empty kiln. Load it wrong and everything moves during firing. Pots fuse together, shelves collapse, everything shatters. Load it right and maybe you get 70% success rate. 70%. That means 30% of everything you've made over the past weeks is going to be destroyed in the firing process. And that's if everything goes well. Medieval pottery was an industry built on accepting massive failure rates as normal. The kiln furniture, the shelves and supports used to stack pots, is already scarred and warped from previous firings. These pieces are made from coarse clay that can withstand repeated heating cycles, and they're coated in a wash of kiln wash, a mixture that prevents pots from fusing to the shelves. Medieval potters reused their kiln furniture until it literally fell apart, because making new furniture was expensive and time-consuming. Some of these shelves look like they've been through dozens of firings and are developing that weathered, stressed appearance that suggests they're one firing away from catastrophic failure. Thomas starts bringing glazed pots from the workshop to the kiln, and you help carry them. This is terrifying because the pots are leather-hard, fragile, covered in unfired glaze that smears if you touch it, and you're carrying them across uneven ground in dimming light. You're convinced you're going to drop something, and when you stumble over a root and nearly do exactly that, your heart rate spikes into the stratospheric range. But you recover, the pot survives, and you make it to the kiln without disaster. Master William begins loading with Thomas's help. The process is meticulous and strategic. Larger, heavier pieces on the bottom shelves where they're more stable. Smaller pieces nested inside larger ones where possible to maximize space. Everything needs a finger's width of clearance on all sides so pots don't touch during firing. If they touch, they fuse together and both pieces are ruined. The kiln slowly fills with pottery arranged in careful, precarious stacks. You're not trusted to actually place pots yet. That's skilled work, but you're responsible for handing pieces to Master William and Thomas as they request them. Medium bowl. You find a medium bowl and pass it up. Small jug. The one with the good handle. You search through the glazed pieces, trying to remember which jug he means, and hand it up. The work continues as the sun sets and someone brings out a rushlight. A reed soaked in tallow that burns with a smoky, flickering flame that barely illuminates anything. The rushlight situation perfectly encapsulates medieval working conditions. You're loading a kiln worth hundreds of hours of labor in near darkness using a light source that's barely brighter than a candle and produces oily smoke that makes your eyes water. Modern safety regulations would have a collective heart attack. Medieval workers just squinted through the smoke and hoped they didn't drop anything expensive. By the time the kiln is fully loaded, which takes nearly 3 hours, you're exhausted and your eyes are burning from rushlight smoke. Master William inspects his work with a critical eye, making tiny adjustments to pot positions. Every piece of pottery you've made this week is in that kiln, plus Thomas's work, plus several pieces from Master William himself. 200 pots representing countless hours of labor, all depending on the next 3 days of firing going exactly right. William seals the kiln door, a carefully shaped clay slab that fits into the opening and gets mortared in place with wet clay. The seal has to be nearly perfect to control airflow during firing. Too much air and the fire gets too hot too fast. Not enough air, and the temperature never climbs high enough for proper glaze maturation. Medieval potters had to read the fire, adjust fuel and airflow by instinct and experience, and basically babysit the kiln around the clock during the 3-day firing cycle. Firing starts tomorrow at dawn, Master William announces. You and Thomas will split watch, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. Keep the fire steady. Feed it regular. Don't let it die, don't let it rage. Wake me if anything seems wrong. This is your new assignment. Stay awake in 4-hour shifts, monitoring a fire that needs to stay hot enough to melt glaze, but not so hot it melts the pots themselves. The temperature inside that kiln needs to reach somewhere around 1000 to 1100 degrees Celsius, sustained for hours, and you're going to control it by shoving wood into a firebox and watching the color of the flames. You stumble back to the workshop with Thomas, who seems completely unfazed by the prospect of days of interrupted sleep tending a fire. First firing is always nerve-wracking, he says, which is not reassuring. You get used to it. Mostly. There's that mostly qualifier again. You're starting to hate that word. You collapse into your straw pile without even eating dinner, too exhausted to care about food. Your last thought before unconsciousness claims you is a vision of that loaded kiln, packed with fragile pots, waiting for fire. Tomorrow, you're going to learn why medieval potters feared fire as much as they depended on it. You're dreaming about pottery exploding when Thomas shakes you awake, which is either prophetic or just your brain processing trauma. It's still dark, always dark, apparently in medieval November, and for a disorienting moment you can't remember where you are or why everything hurts. Then it comes rushing back. Pottery workshop, kiln firing, your new life as a medieval suffering machine. Thomas looks like he hasn't slept either, which is fair because he probably hasn't. Drying day, he mumbles. Got to check the pots before we fire tomorrow. Wait, tomorrow? You'd thought the firing was starting today. Thomas explains while you both stumble toward the morning fire. The kiln loaded yesterday needs today to let everything settle and for the door seal to cure properly. Firing green, potter's term for not quite ready, clay or a wet seal can cause steam explosions that destroy everything. So today is for final preparations, checking that yesterday's glazed pieces have dried properly, and making absolutely sure nothing is going to explode tomorrow when the fire starts. This is medieval pottery's version of a pre-flight checklist, except the plane is made of clay and fire and hope. Breakfast is bread that's somehow gone stale overnight despite being fresh yesterday. Medieval bread dried out fast because it was made without preservatives and stored in conditions that were basically somewhere in the workshop. You gnaw on it while Master William outlines the day's work. First, inspect every piece in the kiln through the spy holes, small openings in the kiln wall that let you peek inside without breaking the seal. Second, prepare 3 days' worth of firewood, split to specific sizes. Third, mix more glaze for the next batch of pots because production never stops. Fourth, general workshop maintenance that's been neglected during the rush to load the kiln. The spy holes are your first glimpse inside the loaded kiln, and it's genuinely impressive in a terrifying way. The pots are stacked floor to ceiling in careful arrangements that look like they're defying gravity. Shelves are supported by clay stilts, rough cylindrical props that bear the weight. Everything is positioned with mathematical precision, and you're suddenly very aware that if anything shifts during heating, it could trigger a domino cascade of destruction. Thomas points out various features. See how the bowls are nested? That's for heat circulation. And those gaps between shelves? Airflow. Everything's about controlling how the heat moves. Master William is checking each spy hole methodically, looking for any pieces that seem unstable or too close together. He spots one jug that's leaning slightly, probably settled after loading, and makes a worried noise. Might topple when it heats. Clay expands. Everything shifts. He debates whether to break the seal and reposition it, which would delay firing another day, or risk it. The internal calculation is pure medieval pragmatism. Time is money, but a collapsed kiln is catastrophic. After a long moment of squinting through the spy hole, he decides to risk it. Should hold. Probably. Probably is doing a lot of work in that sentence. You're learning that medieval pottery is built on probabilities and acceptable risk levels that would horrify modern safety standards. Should the kiln hold? Probably. Will the pots survive firing? Most of them, probably. Will you develop chronic health problems from this work? Probably. But that's years away, so who cares? It's a profession built on gambling with your labor and health and hoping the odds favor you more often than they don't. The firewood preparation is next, and it's more complex than you'd expect. Medieval potters didn't just throw random wood into the kiln. Different woods burned at different temperatures and rates. Oak was prized for its steady, hot burn. Pine was avoided because the resin could cause problems. The wood had to be split to specific sizes, too large and it burned too slowly, too small and it burned too fast and created temperature spikes. Master William has literally a ton of wood stacked behind the workshop, and your job is to split it into kiln-ready pieces. The splitting is done with a maul and wedges, medieval technology at its finest. You set a log upright, position the wedge in a crack, swing the maul, drive the wedge deeper, add more wedges, swing until the log splits. It's repetitive, physically demanding work that absolutely destroys your shoulders and back. After an hour of splitting, your hands are so blistered that holding the maul is agony. After 2 hours, you've entered another pain fugue state where everything hurts equally and you've stopped tracking individual injuries. Thomas works beside you, splitting wood with the efficient rhythm of someone who's done this 1,000 times. He's singing again. Seems to sing constantly while working, and you recognize this one as a popular ballad about a knight and a lady that ends tragically because medieval songs were deeply committed to depressing endings. The singing actually helps. It gives you a rhythm to match your swings, turns the brutal labor into something approaching meditation. Swing on the beat, split the wood, stack the pieces, repeat. Historians still argue whether medieval workers sang specific work songs for different tasks or if they just sang whatever was popular. The evidence suggests both. There were definitely specialized songs for coordinated group work like hauling or rowing, but solo workers like you just sang whatever kept them from going insane with boredom. The singing tradition in workshops lasted well into the industrial age, only dying out when machinery became too loud to sing over. You're participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries and forward to the edge of modernity. A quirky detail about medieval firewood. Wealthy potters could afford to buy pre-split wood from woodcutters, but most small workshops like Master William's couldn't justify the expense. So apprentices split wood, added it to the list of horrible tasks that were character building. The wood you're splitting now is mostly oak from a fallen tree that William bought from a local landowner. He got a good price because the tree had come down in a storm and the landowner wanted it cleared. Medieval economics ran on opportunism and knowing when someone needed to unload something quickly. By midday, you've split enough wood to fuel the kiln through the 3-day firing. It's stacked near the kiln in neat rows, sorted by size. Large pieces for the initial temperature climb, medium for the long middle burn, smaller pieces for fine temperature control during the final phase. Medieval fire management was surprisingly sophisticated because it had to be. Get it wrong and you wasted weeks of work. The wood stack represents about 3 days of heat, which translates to roughly 1.5 cords of oak. Your shoulders will never forgive you. Lunch is bread with some kind of fish paste that's so salty it makes your eyes water. Medieval food preservation relied heavily on salt, and the result was that everything tasted like the ocean regardless of what it originally was. The fish paste is protein though, and your body is screaming for protein after days of mostly bread-based existence. You eat it without complaint because you're learning to be grateful for calories in any form. The afternoon brings glaze mixing for the next batch of pots. This means more grinding of galena, measuring out wood ash, mixing in clay for suspension. It's detailed chemical work, though medieval potters would never have used that term, that requires attention and precision. Too much ash and the glaze won't adhere properly. Too little and it won't melt fully during firing. The ratios are based on generations of trial and error, encoded in recipes that Master William guards jealously. You're grinding galena again, breathing lead dust again, developing another headache again. The cumulative lead exposure you're getting is definitely going to cause problems eventually, but eventually feels distant when you're focused on surviving today. This is the medieval mindset in miniature. Immediate problems dominate, long-term consequences are someone else's worry. Future you might get lead poisoning, but present you needs to grind this galena fine enough that Master William doesn't make you redo it. Thomas is mixing wood ash with water, straining it through cloth to remove chunks. Wood ash contains potash, potassium carbonate, which acts as a flux, lowering the melting point of the glaze. Medieval potters discovered this empirically. Pottery fired with ash glazes came out shinier and more waterproof than unglazed pottery. They didn't understand the chemistry, but they didn't need to. Empirical knowledge works fine when you can't explain why it works. The ash mixture is caustic and Thomas's hands are red and irritated from handling it, but he doesn't complain. Complaining is for people who have other options. Master William combines your ground galena with Thomas's ash mixture, adds clay, adds water, stirs it into a slurry. He tests the consistency by letting it drip off the mixing paddle, watching how it flows, making tiny adjustments based on decades of experience. This glaze will be used for next week's batch of pots. The production cycle never stops. While one batch is firing, you're preparing the next and planning the one after that. Medieval workshops ran on overlapping production schedules that kept everyone constantly busy. The glaze mixing leads to a conversation about glaze chemistry, or rather the medieval understanding of it, which was basically some rocks melt into glass when hot, and if you grind them up and put them on pots, the pots get shiny. Master William explains his thinking. Lead makes it flow smooth, ash helps it stick. Clay keeps it from running off before it fires. This is actually a pretty accurate functional description, even if it lacks the vocabulary of modern chemistry. Medieval craftspeople were empirical scientists who couldn't articulate their science in technical terms. The rest of the afternoon is dedicated to workshop maintenance. Sweeping, always sweeping, though it never seems to get cleaner. Repairing the thatching where leaks have developed. Oiling the pottery wheel bearings. Medieval bearings were wooden shafts that required regular maintenance with animal fat to keep them from seizing up. Sharpening the trimming tools on a whetstone. Medieval workshops required constant upkeep because everything was made from materials that degraded quickly. Wood, leather, rope, thatch. Nothing was permanent. You maintained or you replaced, and replacement was expensive. The sharpening is actually peaceful work. You sit on a bench with the whetstone in your lap, working the wire loops of the trimming tools across it in steady strokes. The rhythmic scraping sound is almost meditative. Thomas works beside you, sharpening knives and wire-cutting tools. For maybe 20 minutes, you're not actively suffering, just doing simple work that doesn't require your body to do impossible things. It's the closest you've come to relaxation since you arrived. Master William appears to inspect your sharpening work. He tests the edge of a trimming loop against his thumb. Why medieval people tested sharpness on their own skin is a mystery, but they all did it and nods approval. Good edge. You're learning. This might be the most positive feedback you've received all week. You're absurdly pleased by it, which shows how thoroughly your standards have been recalibrated by medieval workshop life. Good edge is now a highlight worth remembering. As the sun sets, still depressingly early, Master William gathers you and Thomas for the pre-firing briefing. Tomorrow morning before dawn, the firing begins. Thomas takes the first watch, for hours feeding the fire and monitoring temperature. You take the second watch. This rotation continues for 3 days, which means you're going to spend half of the next 72 hours awake and tending a fire. Sleep deprivation is just another tool in the medieval apprentice experience, apparently. William explains the firing stages in detail. First 12 hours. Slow temperature climb, gentle fire, bringing everything up to heat gradually. This is crucial, too fast and thermal shock cracks the pots. Next 24 hours. Steady high heat, the glaze melting and maturing, everything happening inside that sealed kiln that you can't see but have to trust is working. Final 12 hours. Sustained peak temperature. Then the careful cooling where you stop feeding the fire but leave everything sealed so it cools slowly. Rush the cooling and everything cracks from thermal shock again. The temperature monitoring is done by eye. You watch the color of the flames, the color visible through the spy holes, and you learn to read heat through experience. Red heat, orange heat, yellow heat, each color corresponds to a temperature range. Medieval potters didn't have pyrometers or thermocouples. They had their eyes and their experience, and if they misjudged, everything was lost. You're going to learn this skill by doing it, which is terrifying because your education happens with hundreds of pots at stake. Thomas gives you practical advice. Keep the wood pile neat so you can grab pieces in the dark. Feed the fire regular, don't let it die down then spike it back up. That's how you crack things. Watch the smoke color, white is good, black means you're choking it. And if you see flames coming out the spy holes, wake Master William immediately because something's gone wrong. This is a lot of information to absorb, and you're exhausted already before the actual work has begun. Dinner is a thin pottage, vegetable stew that's mostly water and turnips with some barley for substance. Medieval lower-class meals were volumetrically large but nutritionally sparse. You ate a lot of bulk to feel full without getting many calories or nutrients. The pottage is seasoned with salt and nothing else. Medieval spices were expensive luxuries for the wealthy. Everyone else ate things that tasted primarily like themselves, which in this case means turnips taste like turnips, and that's your entire flavor profile. After dinner, Master William surprises you by producing ale. It's weak small ale, the everyday drink because water was often unsafe, but it's something other than water, and the slightly fermented taste is actually pleasant. Medieval people drank ale with every meal, including breakfast, because alcohol killed bacteria that water carried. They didn't understand the mechanism, but they understood that ale drinkers got sick less than water drinkers. You're drinking beer for breakfast in medieval times, which sounds fun until you remember it's weak, vaguely beer-flavored water, not a proper drink. The workshop settles into evening quiet. Master William reviews his notes. He's one of the rare lower craftsmen who's literate, at least enough to keep basic records. Thomas prepares for his first watch, gathering firewood within easy reach of the kiln. You try to sleep, but your mind is racing with worry about tomorrow. What if you mess up your watch? What if the kiln collapses? What if you've spent the week making pots that are all going to shatter in the firing? The anxiety is consuming. Eventually, exhaustion wins over anxiety and you drift off, your last conscious thought being gratitude that at least you're not on first watch. Thomas is out there now in the dark, starting the fire that will burn for 3 days. The kiln awakening from cold stone to glowing furnace, the temperature climbing degree by degree, the pots inside beginning their transformation from clay to ceramic. When you wake up in 4 hours, it'll be your turn to tend the fire and try not to destroy everything. Medieval pottery, where even sleeping feels like preparation for the next disaster. Thomas is shaking you awake and whispering urgently, which is never a good sign. Your brain struggles through layers of exhaustion to figure out what's happening. Right? Kiln watch. Your turn. for hours of fire tending in the middle of the night. You drag yourself upright, every muscle protesting, and stumble outside into darkness so complete it feels like a physical presence. Medieval nights without light pollution were profoundly, unsettlingly dark. The kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face, where the world reduces to whatever your tiny circle of firelight reveals. The kiln is already glowing, visible from 50 feet away as a dome of dull red heat radiating against the blackness. You can feel the warmth before you reach it, a welcome contrast to the November cold that's trying to turn your extremities into ice. Thomas looks exhausted. 4 hours of constant vigilance will do that, but he walks you through the current state. Fire steady, temperatures climbing slow and even just like master wants. Fed it about every 20 minutes with medium splits. Watch the color through the spy holes. See how it's red-orange now? Needs to get yellower as morning comes. You peer through a spy hole and the heat nearly sears your eyeballs. Inside the kiln is another world. Glowing red darkness where you can barely make out the shapes of stacked pots. Everything bathed in that deep red color that means hot, but not hot enough yet. The air shimmering from the heat makes everything look liquid and unstable. It's beautiful in an unsettling way, like watching the inside of a volcano. Thomas points out the critical details. See how some pots are glowing brighter than others? That's uneven heat. You want everything the same color eventually. Feed the fire steady and it evens out. He shows you the wood pile he's organized, medium splits within easy reach, larger pieces for when you need to boost temperature, smaller ones for fine control. The firebox opening is at ground level, a rectangular mouth that breathes heat and light. You have to crouch or kneel to feed wood in, which means you'll be spending the next 4 hours alternating between squatting and kneeling on cold ground while heat blasts your face. Medieval ergonomics strikes again. Thomas wishes you luck and stumbles off toward the workshop and blessed sleep, leaving you alone with the fire. The first hour is nerve-wracking. You're hyper-aware that hundreds of hours of work are inside this kiln, depending on you not screwing up. You feed wood carefully, checking the spy holes obsessively, watching for any sign that something's going wrong. The fire consumes the splits with a roar that's surprisingly loud in the night silence. Sparks spiral up through the chimney like confused stars. The heat is intense enough that you have to keep backing away to cool down, then approaching again to feed more wood. Your face alternates between baking and freezing depending on which direction you're facing. The rhythm of fire tending gradually becomes automatic. Check the spy holes for color, check the flames for consistency. Add wood when the roar diminishes slightly. Use the iron poker to arrange burning wood for even heat distribution. Step back and breathe cool air. Repeat. 20 minutes between feedings, Thomas said. You count in your head because medieval apprentices didn't have watches. You count seconds by reciting prayers. Medieval people measured short time intervals by how long it took to say a Paternoster or an Ave Maria. It's surprisingly accurate if you say them at a consistent pace. Around the middle of your second hour, you notice the color through the spy holes has shifted subtly redder on one side of the kiln. This is the uneven heating Thomas warned about. You feed slightly more wood to that side of the firebox, trying to push more heat to the cooler zone. The adjustment seems to work. Over the next 30 minutes, the colors even out. You feel absurdly proud of this minor success, which again shows how thoroughly medieval workshop life has recalibrated your expectations. Didn't ruin the kiln is now an achievement worth celebrating. The night sounds are strange when you're alone with your thoughts and a fire. Somewhere in the town, a dog is barking persistently. The wind occasionally gusts, making the flames surge and dance. An owl hoots from the trees behind the workshop. Medieval nights were full of wildlife sounds that modern urban existence has silenced. You feed the fire, watch the coals, and think about nothing in particular. The exhaustion is so complete that thinking feels impossible anyway. You exist in a narrow present. Fire now, wood now, heat now. Historians still argue whether sleep deprivation was a deliberate part of medieval apprentice training, building character through suffering, or just an unfortunate necessity of craft work that required constant attention. The evidence suggests it was both. Kilns needed continuous monitoring, but masters also believed that hardship created skilled craftspeople. The logic was medieval but not entirely wrong. People who could function while exhausted, in pain, and stressed were more reliable workers. You were being forged like the pots in the kiln, hardened by controlled suffering. Around your third hour, the temperature is noticeably higher. The color through the spy holes has progressed from red-orange to a brighter orange, and the heat coming off the kiln has intensified to the point where you can't stand directly in front of the firebox for more than a few seconds. Your face is perpetually flushed and probably sunburned from heat exposure. Medieval potters had distinctive weathered, reddened faces from years of kiln work, basically a professional marker that said, "I work with fire," as clearly as a name tag. The wood consumption is steady and slightly terrifying. You're burning through splits at a rate that's visibly depleting the pile Thomas prepared. Medieval potters needed access to substantial wood supplies, which was one reason pottery workshops clustered near forests or woodlands. Running out of fuel mid-firing was catastrophic. You couldn't just pause a kiln firing and restart it. The pots would crack from uneven cooling and reheating. So you watched your wood pile anxiously and did math in your head about whether there was enough to reach the end of your watch. A quirky detail about medieval kiln firing. Some potters threw salt into the kiln at peak temperature to create salt glaze, a technique that produced distinctive orange peel textured surfaces on pottery. The salt vaporized and deposited sodium on the pots, creating a glassy coating. Master William doesn't use this technique. He's a traditional lead glaze potter, but you've heard Thomas mention it as something the larger workshops in town experiment with. Salt glazing required higher temperatures and more fuel, so it was expensive. But the results were distinctive and commanded premium prices. Your fourth hour blurs into exhausted repetition. Feed wood, check spy holes, poke holes, feed wood. The sky is just beginning to lighten in the east, that pre-dawn gray that signals morning is approaching. The kiln color is now a bright orange, nearly yellow in the hottest spots. The temperature is climbing toward where it needs to be for the glaze to melt, though you're still hours away from peak heat. You've successfully kept the fire steady through your watch. Nothing has exploded, collapsed, or otherwise catastrophized. This counts as victory. Master William appears from the workshop just as your 4 hours end, looking somehow alert despite the early hour. He inspects the kiln with his critical eye, checking each spy hole, examining the wood pile, watching the flame color. Finally, he grunts approval. Even heat. Good. You're so tired that his praise barely registers, but some part of your brain files it away as evidence that you're not completely useless. Thomas staggers out for his second watch, and you retreat to the workshop to collapse. Sleep is immediate and total, despite the fact that it's now dawn and the workshop is filling with gray light. You're unconscious before your head fully settles into the straw. For hours pass in what feels like 4 seconds. Then Thomas is shaking you awake again for your second watch. Your body screams protest. You cannot possibly do this again. Your reserves are empty. This is impossible. But you do it anyway because medieval apprentices didn't have the option of calling in sick or taking mental health days. You staggered to your feet and did the work, or you failed out of your apprenticeship and found yourself unemployed in an economy that offered few alternatives. The second watch is midday, which means you're tending fire in full sunlight while the kiln radiates enough heat to make the surrounding air shimmer like a desert. The temperature inside has climbed substantially. The spy hole color is now yellow-orange, bright enough to hurt your eyes when you peek inside. The pots are visible as glowing shapes, and you think you can see the glaze starting to look wet and glossy, though it's hard to tell through the visual distortion from heat. The wood feeding is continuous now. Peak firing requires more fuel to maintain the high temperature. You're going through splits every 15 minutes instead of every 20. Your arms ache from wielding the poker, arranging burning wood for optimal heat distribution. Your face is definitely sunburned from hours of heat exposure. Sweat is pouring down your back despite the November chill because you're standing next to what is essentially a contained inferno. Medieval potters probably had the strangest tan lines. Faces and forearms burned dark, everything else pale from wool clothing coverage. Around the middle of your second watch, you have your first real scare. You're peering through a spy hole when you see one of the kiln shelves sagging visibly. The clay props supporting it are softening from the heat, not melting exactly, but deforming under the weight of the stacked pots above. If it collapses completely, everything on that shelf and potentially shelves above it will tumble into a chaotic pile of broken pottery. You watch in horror as the sag increases slowly, millimeter by millimeter. You should wake Master William. This is definitely a wake the master if anything seems wrong situation. But William is sleeping after his own watch and you're terrified of waking him unnecessarily. You make a split-second decision to wait and see if the shelf stabilizes. Medieval apprentices learned to make judgment calls because masters couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. You watch through the spy hole, barely breathing, as the shelf continues its slow deformation. Then, mercifully, it stops sagging. The clay props have compressed to a new stable configuration. The shelf holds. The pots remain stacked. You let out a breath you didn't know you were holding. This incident provides visceral understanding of why medieval pottery had high failure rates. Everything in the kiln is at the edge of its physical limits. Clay shelves supporting hundreds of pounds at temperatures that make them plastic. Pots expanding and contracting as they heat. Glaze melting and flowing. Any one of 1,000 variables could go wrong, and when something did go wrong, it usually took other things with it in a cascade of destruction. You were gambling every single firing, and the only way to get good odds was through experience measured in decades. The rest of your watch is spent in heightened anxiety, checking that shelf obsessively through the spy hole. It holds. The temperature continues climbing. The kiln reaches peak heat, bright yellow visible through the spy holes, painful to look at directly. The glaze on the pots looks liquid now, shiny and molten, coating the clay beneath. This is the crucial phase where everything either works or doesn't. The lead in the glaze is melting, flowing, bonding to the clay body. The temperature has to be just right. Too cool and the glaze doesn't melt completely. Too hot and it runs off the pots entirely, or the pots themselves begin to deform. Master William appears to check the peak firing, even though it's technically your watch. He examines each spy hole with expert attention, reading the temperature and heat distribution through color alone. Good color. Hold it steady. He shows you how to maintain peak temperature. Smaller wood pieces fed more frequently, keeping the roar of the fire consistent. This is the delicate phase where small variations could ruin everything. You feed wood with obsessive precision, watching the flame color, listening to the fire's roar, trying to maintain absolute consistency. Your second watch ends with the kiln still at peak temperature. Thomas takes over, looking grim and determined. You've been awake for 8 of the last 12 hours, sleeping in broken 4-hour chunks, and you're starting to understand why medieval potters looked perpetually exhausted. The 3-day firing meant 3 days of split sleep, constant vigilance, and physical work in extreme heat. Your body feels like it's been put through a medieval torture device, which isn't far from truth. You collapse into straw and pass out immediately. The cycle continues. 4 hours of broken sleep, 4 hours of fire tending. Repeat. Day becomes night, becomes day again in a blur of exhaustion and heat. By your third watch, middle of the second night, you're operating on autopilot, your body performing the tasks while your mind floats somewhere else entirely. Feed wood, check spy holes, poke holes. The motions are automatic now, muscle memory formed through desperate repetition. The temperature begins its gradual descent during the late second day. You're no longer feeding wood as frequently. The fire is allowed to die down slowly, carefully, bringing the kiln temperature down at a controlled rate. This is as critical as the heating phase, cool too fast and thermal shock cracks everything, cool too slowly and you waste fuel and time. Master William monitors this phase personally, checking the color change from yellow to orange to red, calculating the cooling rate through decades of experience. By the third day, the firebox is cold and the kiln is sealed completely, cooling on its own. You, Thomas, and Master William are all dead on your feet. 3 days of split sleep and constant vigilance has reduced you to shambling zombies. But the firing is done. Whatever is inside that kiln is finished, for better or worse. Now comes the agonizing wait for the kiln to cool enough to open. Usually another full day because opening it too soon lets in cold air that can crack hot pots. You spend the fourth day in a haze, doing simple workshop tasks that don't require thought. Cleaning tools, organizing supplies, wedging clay for the next batch of pots. The production cycle continues even as you wait for the last cycle's results. Thomas is making new pots on the wheel. You're back to trimming leather-hard pieces from the previous week. The work never stops, even when you're too exhausted to think straight. Master William is checking the kiln temperature by holding his hand near the walls and feeling the radiant heat. Medieval potters developed this skill through experience. They could gauge temperature within a reasonable range just by proximity. He declares it's still too hot to open. Another night of waiting. Another night of anxiety about what you'll find when the kiln finally unseals. That night, you dream of exploding pots and collapsing shelves. You wake up gasping, convinced the kiln has failed catastrophically, only to find the workshop quiet and peaceful in the pre-dawn darkness. Just dreams. Just the accumulated stress of the last week expressing itself in nightmare form. You lie in your straw pile and try to calculate what percentage of the kiln load you made personally. Maybe 15%? 20%? If the firing failed, weeks of your work is gone. That thought is somehow more terrifying than any of the physical suffering you've endured. Medieval pottery, where success is never guaranteed and failure is always catastrophic. Morning of the fifth day arrives with the weight of Judgment Day, which is basically what it is for a pottery workshop. Master William declares the kiln cool enough to open. Barely, which means it's still radiantly hot but won't cause immediate thermal shock when outside air rushes in. You, Thomas, and William gather around the sealed door like surgeons preparing for a delicate operation. The tension is palpable. Everything you've worked on for the past 2 weeks is behind that clay-mortared door, transformed by fire into either success or expensive rubble. William begins chipping away the door seal with a chisel, working carefully to avoid jarring the contents. Medieval kiln doors were one-use items. You mortared them shut for firing, then destroyed them to open, then made a new door for the next firing. The clay crumbles away in chunks, and heat billows out through the widening gap. It's like opening a portal to somewhere profoundly uncomfortable. Your face is immediately flushed from the heat, and you're standing 3 feet back. William, working right at the opening, is sweating through his tunic. The door finally comes free and the kiln interior is revealed. Even through the heat shimmer and dim light, you can see pots. Intact pots. Rows of glazed pottery stacked on their shelves, glowing faintly with retained heat, looking miraculously whole. Your heart surges with hope. Maybe this actually worked. Then William leans in with a candle to get better light, and his face falls slightly. Some casualties. Always are. He points, and you see what he means. A collapsed section on that shelf you watch sag during firing. Maybe a dozen pots crushed together in a fused mass. Another shelf has a jug that tipped and welded itself to 3 bowls during firing, creating an abstract sculpture that's useless but oddly artistic. The unloading process is excruciating. The kiln is still hot enough to burn skin. Not quite glowing anymore, but definitely touch this and you'll regret it temperature. William uses long wooden paddles to reach in and carefully extract pots from the upper shelves, passing them to Thomas, who sets them on the ground to cool. You're on cleanup duty, sweeping up pottery shards from broken pieces and trying not to look too closely at which pots failed. Some failures are obvious. Cracked from thermal shock, exploded from trapped air bubbles, warped from being placed too close to the hottest part of the kiln. The first pots that emerge are from the cooler upper shelves. Small bowls and cups that fired reasonably well. Most are intact, though the glaze quality varies wildly. Some have beautiful, smooth, yellow-brown surfaces. Others are mottled and rough because they were in a cooler zone where the glaze didn't quite melt fully. Medieval pottery quality was inconsistent because temperature distribution in a wood-fired kiln was inconsistent. You learn to accept variation as normal, and customers learn to judge each piece individually rather than expecting factory uniformity. Thomas extracts one of your bowls, you recognize it by a distinctive wobble in the rim, and it's actually decent. The glaze is smooth, the form is intact, and aside from being slightly lopsided, it's a functional bowl that could sell. You feel absurdly emotional about this ugly little bowl surviving its trial by fire. It's proof that you made something, that your suffering produced a tangible result. Master William examines it critically and sets it in the sellable pile without comment, which is basically high praise from him. The unloading continues for hours. The kiln yields its treasures and disasters slowly, each piece telling a story about what happened during the 3-day firing. Pots from the hot zone near the firebox are often overfired. The glaze ran too much, creating thick puddles at the bottom or even welding pots to the kiln shelves. Pots from the cool zones are underfired. The glaze is rough and matte instead of smooth and glossy. The sweet spot in the middle produced the best results, and Master William had deliberately placed his premium pieces there. Historians still argue whether medieval potters understood heat distribution well enough to strategically place pots, or if they just loaded randomly and hoped for the best. The evidence from kiln excavations suggests the former. Professional potters definitely knew their kilns and loaded accordingly. William's loading strategy becomes obvious as you unload. Utilitarian pieces in the hot and cool zones where quality was unpredictable, showcase pieces in the optimal zones. It's risk management built into the kiln architecture. Around midday, you reach the section where your pieces were loaded. Out of maybe 30 pots you threw, about 20 survived intact. 10 casualties, not terrible odds for a first-week apprentice. Several of your bowls made it through successfully. 2 of your jugs are complete and glazed, though one has a crack that will make it leak. Your best piece, that jug Master William called adequate, emerges with a smooth glaze and intact form. It's still ugly, lumpy, and asymmetric with a handle that's slightly crooked, but it's a complete functional jug that could hold liquid without leaking. You made that. Through all the suffering and incompetence, you produced an actual usable object. Thomas's success rate is higher. Maybe 70% of his pieces survived because he's got 3 years of experience. Master William's personal pieces are nearly all successful because he's been doing this for decades and knows exactly how to throw pots that survive firing. But even William has casualties. A large storage jar cracked spectacularly, and a decorative jug overfired so badly the glaze ran completely off one side. Even masters fail regularly in medieval pottery. The craft simply doesn't allow for perfect success rates. The final count, once everything is unloaded and sorted, about 140 intact, sellable pieces out of the 200 loaded. That's a 70% success rate, which William declares acceptable in a tone that suggests it's actually pretty good. 30% casualty rate is normal, expected, built into the business model. The broken pieces get smashed and ground into grog for mixing into future clay batches. Nothing is wasted, even in failure. The kiln interior, now fully visible, is a disaster zone of dripped glaze, broken pottery shards, and warped clay furniture. The shelf that sagged during firing is permanently deformed and probably not reusable. Several kiln props cracked under load and will need replacing. The floor is covered in glaze drips that have fused to the brick and will need to be chipped off before the next firing. Kiln maintenance is constant and labor-intensive. You're essentially rebuilding portions of the kiln after every firing. William assigns you and Thomas to kiln cleanup, which is exactly as terrible as it sounds. You're inside the still warm kiln, breathing dust and fumes, chipping hardened glaze off brick surfaces with a chisel. The space is cramped and hot, with barely enough room to move. Your back is cramped from crouching. Your hands are blistered from gripping tools. And the glazed dust you're creating is full of lead particles that you're definitely inhaling. Medieval potters absolutely developed respiratory problems from kiln work, silica dust from clay, lead dust from glaze, and general particulate matter from ash and smoke all combined to destroy lung function over years. A quirky detail about medieval kiln maintenance. Some potters would coat the kiln interior with a thin layer of clay slip after each firing to protect the brick and make cleanup easier. The slip would burn off during the next firing but provided a temporary barrier against glaze drips. Master William doesn't use this technique. He prefers direct brick contact for better heat retention. But Thomas mentions it as something he learned from a journeyman who worked in a different workshop. Knowledge sharing between workshops was limited because techniques were trade secrets, but apprentices who moved between shops carried information with them. The cleanup takes the rest of the day. By evening, the kiln is reasonably clean and William begins planning repairs. That sagged shelf needs replacing. Several props need to be remade. The firebox door needs a new seal. The chimney has developed a crack that needs patching. Each firing degrades the kiln slightly, and maintenance is constant to keep it functional. A well-maintained kiln might last 20 years. A poorly maintained one could fail catastrophically after a handful of firings, destroying itself and potentially the workshop around it. Dinner that night feels almost celebratory. William's wife sends over actual meat, a small portion of pork that's probably from a pig slaughtered as winter provisions are being laid in. Meat is a luxury, a signal that the successful firing is worth acknowledging. You gnaw on pork that's tough and salty and absolutely delicious compared to the endless bread and turnips. Medieval celebratory meals weren't elaborate by modern standards, but they were meaningfully different from everyday meals, and that difference mattered. Master William is calculating finances, muttering numbers under his breath. 140 sellable pieces. Pots sell for anywhere from a penny for simple bowls to 6 pence for large glazed storage jars. The math works out to maybe 15 shillings total if he sells everything at market minus the cost of materials, clay, wood, glaze materials, and his cut to the guild. After expenses, he might clear 8 or 9 shillings profit from 3 weeks of work for 3 people. Medieval pottery was not a lucrative profession. You worked constantly, risked everything with each firing, and earned modest returns that kept you fed but never wealthy. Thomas explains the economic reality. Master clears maybe £30 a year if he's lucky. That's after paying guild dues, buying materials, maintaining the workshop. He pays me 8 pence a week as a senior apprentice. You get room and board and training, no wage first year. £30 a year was a respectable but not impressive income for a craftsman. Enough to rent a workshop and house, feed a family, and occasionally eat meat. Compare that to a successful merchant who might clear £100, or a knight with lands generating £500. Potters were firmly lower middle class, above laborers but below anyone who worked in precious metals or long-distance trade. The conversation turns to the future, specifically what happens to apprentices after their training. Thomas has 2 more years before he can apply for journeyman status. Then he'll need to find work, probably traveling to different workshops to learn varied techniques and build reputation. After several years as a journeyman, assuming he survives the traveling, the variable employment, and the economic precarity, he can apply to the guild for master status. That requires submitting a masterpiece pot for judgment, paying substantial fees, and proving he has capital to set up an independent workshop. Most don't make it, Thomas admits. Maybe 1 in 4 apprentices becomes a master. Rest stay journeyman, or switch trades, or just disappear. The medieval career ladder had a lot of rungs, and most people fell off before reaching the top. The guild system was designed to limit competition. Masters didn't want too many independent workshops competing for customers, so they made the requirements deliberately difficult. You could be a skilled potter and still never get permission to open your own shop because the guild decided the market couldn't support another master. That night, lying in your straw pile, you reflect on what you've learned this week. Medieval pottery wasn't a romantic craft practiced by gentle artisans. It was brutal physical labor performed under terrible conditions by people who had limited alternatives. The work destroyed your body systematically. Repetitive stress injuries from will work, respiratory problems from dust, lead poisoning from glaze, burns from kiln work, chronic exhaustion from impossible schedules. The economic returns were modest. The social status was low. The failure rate was high. And yet, people did it. They apprenticed, they learned, they practiced, they became masters and opened workshops and trained their own apprentices. They spent their lives making utilitarian objects that would be used briefly and broken and forgotten. Chamber pots, cooking vessels, storage jars, nothing glamorous, nothing that would outlast them significantly. Why? Partially because medieval people had limited options. Partially because craft pride was real even in humble professions. And partially because humans are surprisingly resilient and can adapt to almost any level of suffering if it's normalized as just how things are. You've survived 1 week. The kiln firing is complete. Some of your pots survived. You're slowly, painfully learning skills that medieval craftspeople spent years mastering. Your body is adapting, your hands are toughening, your legs are strengthening, your tolerance for discomfort is expanding. But you're also accumulating damage that won't heal. The slight tremor in your right hand from wedging clay, the persistent ache in your lower back from will work, the chronic headache from lead exposure. These are the costs of medieval craft work, paid in bodily harm spread over years. Tomorrow, the production cycle starts again. New clay to dig, shred, wedge, throw, trim, glaze, and fire. The workshop never stops because stopping means no income, and no income means starvation. Master William will start throwing pots for the next kiln load. Thomas will prepare materials, and you'll do whatever task is assigned, moving through the familiar cycle of suffering that constitutes medieval pottery work. You close your eyes and try to imagine doing this for 7 more years until your apprenticeship ends. Then more years as a journeyman if you survive that long and can find work. Then maybe, possibly, if you're incredibly lucky and tough and skilled, becoming a master with your own workshop where you can inflict similar suffering on your own apprentices. The prospect is exhausting, but it's also what countless medieval people did, generation after generation, making the unglamorous objects that kept society functioning. Welcome to day 5 of your medieval pottery apprenticeship. You've learned that wouldn't last a day is optimistic. You might last a week, maybe even a month, before your body or spirit breaks completely. But lasting 7 years? Surviving to become a journeyman? Building a career in this profession? That requires something medieval craftspeople had in abundance. The ability to endure, to accept suffering as normal, and to find meaning in creating functional objects despite the enormous personal cost. You wouldn't last a day in a medieval pottery workshop. But even if you did, you definitely wouldn't last a week. And the 7 years required for a complete apprenticeship? That's not a challenge. It's a life sentence served in clay dust and kiln heat, paid for with your youth and health and any romantic notions about medieval craft work you might have foolishly harbored. Week 2 begins exactly like Week 1 ended. Too early, too cold, too tired. But there's a subtle shift in the atmosphere that you only recognize because you've survived enough days to notice patterns. Master William seems fractionally less disapproving when he inspects your work. Thomas has stopped watching you constantly to ensure you don't catastrophically fail at basic tasks. You're no longer the brand new apprentice who might accidentally burn down the workshop. Now you're just the regular incompetent apprentice, which is actually progress in medieval terms. The successful kiln firing means it's market day. Master William loads the sellable pottery onto a wooden handcart. 140 pieces carefully packed with straw between layers to prevent breakage during transport. You and Thomas are assigned to push the cart through town to the weekly market, which sounds simple until you remember that medieval streets were unpaved, rutted, often muddy disasters designed by Satan himself. The cart has wooden wheels with iron rims that clatter over every stone and drop into every hole, threatening to tip the entire load into the dirt. The market is in the town square, open space that's already filling with merchants and craftspeople setting up stalls. There are cloth sellers, a butcher with hanging carcasses that are attracting flies despite the November cold, a woman selling vegetables that look like they've seen better months, and several other pottery sellers who are apparently your competition. Master William secures a spot. You have to pay a fee to the market official for the privilege of selling, and begins arranging pots for display. The presentation matters. Better pieces in front, utilitarian stuff in back, everything positioned to look abundant and appealing. Medieval market dynamics were fascinating and ruthless. Pottery was a competitive business with multiple workshops selling similar goods. Price undercutting was common. Quality varied wildly, and customers were surprisingly savvy. They knew what good pottery looked like and wouldn't pay premium prices for inferior work. Master William positions himself as a mid-tier seller. Not the cheapest workshop producing barely functional garbage, not the premium workshop charging luxury prices, but a reliable source of decent pottery at fair prices. It's a business strategy that requires consistently adequate work, which explains why he's so demanding during training. You watch as customers begin browsing. A housewife picks up one of your bowls, that wobbly one you're oddly proud of, and examines it critically. She checks the glaze for smoothness, the rim for evenness, the foot ring for stability. She sets it down without buying, moves to a competitor's stall, compares prices, returns, haggles with Master William over price, and finally purchases 3 bowls for 4 pence total. Medieval shopping was a prolonged negotiation process. Fixed prices weren't really a thing. You bargained for everything, and both buyers and sellers expected it. Thomas explains the market economics quietly while Master William handles customers. Those bowls cost maybe a halfpenny each in materials and labor, accounting for failures. He's selling at 4-to-1 markup, which is standard. But he'll haggle down to 3-to-1 if the customer's persistent. The profit margins are thin when you account for the 30% loss rate in firing and the weeks of labor involved. Medieval pottery was a volume business. You made a lot of pots, sold most of them at small margins, and hoped the cumulative profit kept you fed. A wealthier customer, you can tell by his better quality clothes and the fact that he's not covered in mud, is examining the premium pieces. He picks up one of Master William's large storage jars, beautifully glazed and symmetrical, clearly the work of a master craftsman. The haggling is more restrained here because both parties know this is quality work. The jar sells for 8 pence, which represents maybe a day's wages for a laborer. Pottery ranged from cheap necessities to semi-luxury goods depending on quality and size. Between customers, Thomas shares workshop gossip. The Pottery Workshop 2 streets over had a kiln collapse last month. destroying everything and injuring the master's hand badly enough that he can't throw anymore. He's probably going to have to close the workshop, and his apprentices will need to find new placements. Another workshop is rumored to be experimenting with higher temperature firing that produces harder pottery, but they're keeping the technique secret. Medieval craft knowledge was intellectual property before that concept existed. You protected your techniques because they were your competitive advantage. Historians still argue whether medieval guilds primarily existed to maintain quality standards or to limit competition and keep prices high. The evidence suggests both. Guilds did enforce minimum quality standards. Truly garbage work could get you expelled, but they also strictly controlled who could produce and sell goods, essentially operating as craft cartels. Master William pays his guild dues, follows guild regulations about pricing and materials, and in return enjoys some protection from price-cutting competition. It's a system that benefits established masters while making it difficult for newcomers to enter the market. By midday, William has sold about 60 pieces, nearly half the kiln load. That's actually good for a market day. The money, a mix of silver pennies and the occasional groat, goes into a leather pouch that William guards carefully. Medieval markets were opportunities for theft, and merchants protected their earnings vigilantly. There are no banks in the modern sense, no safe deposit boxes. You kept your money on your person or hidden in your workshop, and you hope thieves didn't find it. The market atmosphere is lively in a medieval way, which means it's muddy, smelly, loud, and vaguely threatening. Arguments break out over prices and quality. A fight nearly starts when someone accuses a cloth merchant of using weighted scales. Children run around stealing scraps where they can. Dogs fight over something disgusting near the butcher's stall. Medieval public spaces were chaotic, barely controlled environments where commerce and conflict coexisted uneasily. You're grateful to be standing behind Master William's bulk, which provides some protection from the crowd. A customer asks about custom work. She wants a set of matching bowls in a specific size for her household. Master William quotes a price and a timeline. 2 weeks, 6 shillings for 8 matching bowls. She haggles. They settle on 5 shillings if she accepts minor variations in size and glaze. This is how custom orders worked: negotiated prices, flexible timelines, understood imperfections. Medieval customers had realistic expectations about craft work because they understood the production process. Everyone knew pottery came from kilns that didn't guarantee perfect results. You're sent back to the workshop mid-afternoon with the handcart, now much lighter, and instructions to start preparing clay for the next production cycle. Thomas stays with Master William to finish the market day. The solo walk through town gives you time to observe medieval urban life from a slightly less exhausted perspective. The town is maybe 2,000 people, a respectable size for the period. Most buildings are timber frame with wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, and a general air of being one strong wind away from collapse. The streets are truly terrible. Mud mixed with animal waste, garbage, and things you choose not to identify. Medieval sanitation was basically, throw it in the street and hope it washes away eventually. The smell is omnipresent. You've somewhat adapted to it, but it still hits you in waves when the wind shifts. People empty chamber pots from upper windows with minimal warning. Pigs and chickens wander freely. It's dirty and organic and alive in ways modern cities aren't, and not in a good way. Back at the workshop, you begin the familiar cycle. Clay needs digging, which means a trip to the riverbank with baskets and that terrible spade. Your body protests. You've barely recovered from last week's abuse, but protest is irrelevant. The work doesn't care if you're tired. Medieval labor didn't accommodate personal feelings or physical limitations. You worked through pain until your body adapted or broke, and most bodies eventually broke given enough time. The riverbank is quiet this afternoon, just you and the sound of your spade cutting into clay. The repetitive physical labor becomes meditative in an exhausted way. dig, lever, lift, dump. Your hands are toughening. The blisters from last week have hardened into calluses. Your back still hurts but differently, a deep ache rather than sharp pain. Your body is adapting to the demands, becoming a medieval body shaped by medieval work. This transformation is both impressive and depressing. You're becoming functional in this environment by losing the softness that made you comfortable in modernity. A quirky observation. Medieval people's bodies were visibly different from modern bodies because work shaped them so dramatically. Potters had asymmetrically developed legs and forearms. Blacksmiths had enormous upper body strength. Agricultural laborers had gnarled hands and bent backs. Your profession was literally written on your physique, a form of identification that transcended clothing or social markers. You could spot a potter by how they walked, how they held their hands, the reddish cast to their face from kiln work. You fill 4 baskets of clay, the standard daily quota, and haul them back to the workshop as the sun begins its early winter descent. Master William and Thomas return from market looking pleased. The day's sales were good enough to cover this week's expenses and provide small profit. In medieval terms, this means everyone eats adequately this week and there's coin left over for materials. The absence of financial crisis is as close to success as most craftspeople got. Dinner is pottage again, but tonight it has actual chunks of meat from the market, probably offcuts from the butcher that were affordable. Medieval lower-class people ate meat rarely, and when they did it was usually the parts that wealthier people rejected. Organ meat, gristly bits, things that required long cooking to become edible. You eat it gratefully because protein is protein and your body is desperate for calories to fuel the constant physical labor. The evening brings will work, which your legs have learned to dread. Master William wants 20 basic bowls thrown tonight for the next kiln load. Thomas will throw 10, you're responsible for 10, and William will handle more complex pieces. Medieval workshops distributed work according to skill level, with apprentices handling simple repetitive tasks, while masters focused on pieces that required expertise. It's efficient production organization that maximized the master's time and gave apprentices structured practice. You center clay, easier now after a week of practice, and begin throwing bowls. Your success rate has improved marginally. Maybe 6 out of 10 attempts produce sellable bowls instead of last week's 4 out of 10. The improvement is measurable but still humbling. You're working at maybe 15% of Master William's speed and producing work that's maybe 60% as good. Medieval apprenticeship required years because skill development was slow and there were no shortcuts. You learned by doing, failed repeatedly, gradually improved, and eventually maybe achieved competence. The pottery wheel has become your nemesis but also your teacher. It's perfectly honest. If you're off-center, it shows you immediately with violent wobbling. If your walls are uneven, they collapse. If you use too much water, the clay gets soupy. If you let the wheel slow down, everything goes wrong. Provides instant feedback that's harsh but educational. Medieval craft training didn't involve much verbal instruction because the work itself taught you through immediate, often painful consequences. Around the 8th bowl, your leg cramps completely. The wheel slows, the pot warps, and you have to stop and stand up to stretch. Thomas glances over with sympathy. Leg cramps don't stop. You just get better at working through them. This is medieval wisdom in miniature. Discomfort is permanent, you just increase your tolerance for it. The idea that work should be comfortable or that your body's complaints should be addressed is fundamentally modern. Medieval workers accepted pain as the normal cost of production. You finish your 10th bowl around the time the workshop candles burn low. Expensive tallow candles that Master William only uses for evening work when absolutely necessary. Medieval artificial lighting was dim, expensive, and reserved for essential tasks. Most people went to bed when the sun set because doing anything in darkness was difficult and dangerous. But production schedules sometimes required evening work, so you squinted by candlelight and hoped you didn't make expensive mistakes in the dimness. The day ends with all of you exhausted but having met the production quotas. 20 bowls thrown and set to dry. 4 baskets of clay dug and ready for treading. The market income recorded in Master William's careful accounts. It's been a successful day by medieval standards, which means nothing catastrophic happened and work progressed adequately. The bar for success was so low it was practically subterranean, but when you met it consistently you survived, and survival was the primary goal. That night, settling into your straw pile, you realize you're thinking differently about time. Modern life measures time in hours and minutes, scheduled precisely and filled with discrete tasks. Medieval craft life measures time in production cycles. Clay to pot takes 2 weeks, kiln firing takes a week, market day is weekly. Time flows in workshop rhythms rather than clock divisions. You don't wonder what time it is, you know by the light, by how tired you are, by what task you're doing. It's a fundamentally different relationship with temporal measurement. You've also stopped thinking about the future beyond tomorrow. Modern anxiety often focuses on long-term uncertainties, career trajectory, retirement planning, life goals. Medieval apprentice life is so consuming that you can barely think past the next meal, the next task, the next time you'll be allowed to sleep. It's oddly liberating in a grim way. When survival demands your full attention, existential worries about meaning and purpose fade. You're too busy existing to worry about why you exist. Sleep comes quickly, your body shutting down the moment you're horizontal. Tomorrow will bring the same cycle. Wake too early, work too hard, eat too little, sleep too briefly. The weeks will blur into months, the months into years. And if you survive, you'll emerge as a journeyman potter with skills, damaged body, and limited prospects. This is the medieval craft pathway, walked by countless people who had few alternatives and made the best of the constrained options life offered them. You wouldn't last a day in a medieval pottery workshop. But if somehow you lasted a week, you're learning what it takes to last longer. The ability to disconnect your consciousness from your body's protests, to find satisfaction in tiny improvements, to accept suffering as the baseline rather than the exception, and to keep showing up day after day regardless of how much you want to quit. Medieval endurance wasn't heroic. It was just the grinding persistence required to survive when giving up meant destitution or death. 3 weeks into your apprenticeship, you're starting to understand a terrible truth about medieval pottery work. It never gets better, you just get more efficient at suffering. Your body has adapted in the ways bodies do when torture becomes routine. Thicker calluses, stronger legs, higher pain tolerance. But the work remains exactly as brutal as day one. You've just learned to process brutality faster and with less emotional resistance. This is what medieval people meant by character building. The systematic elimination of your expectation that life should be pleasant. The morning routine is automatic now. Wake in darkness, stumble to the workshop fire, eat bread that tastes like despair and sawdust, begin whatever task Master William assigns. Today it's back to the clay pit for treading, which you haven't done since week 1. Your legs remember instantly and lodge formal complaints. The cold clay swallowing your feet, the endless stomping rhythm, the stones that need working out, the alkaline burn on your skin. None of it has become easier, you've just developed the psychological mechanisms to endure it without breaking down crying. Thomas is beside you in his own pit, treading with mechanical efficiency while humming a tune that's probably supposed to be cheerful but sounds vaguely funereal in the dank morning air. He's been doing this for 3 years and will do it for 2 more before he can even attempt to escape apprenticeship. The math is horrifying. 5 years of treading clay, kicking pottery wheels, breathing lead dust, and sleeping on straw for the privilege of becoming a journeyman with no guaranteed employment. Medieval career planning was essentially suffer now in hopes of suffering slightly less later, probably. You tread for 3 hours. Your legs are shaking, your feet are white and wrinkled, and you've worked out maybe 24 stones from the clay. Master William inspects the results and declares them adequate, which you've learned is his maximum enthusiasm. The clay goes into storage to age. Another step in the process you hadn't appreciated. Clay actually improves with age as the mineral particles align and bacterial action breaks down organic matter. Medieval potters kept clay aging in damp storage for months when possible, though small workshops like William's usually couldn't afford to have that much capital tied up in raw materials. The rest of the morning is will work. You're assigned to throw storage jars, which are larger and more complex than the bowls you've been practicing. Storage jars need thick walls to hold their shape, narrow necks for sealing, and sturdy bases to bear weight. Your first attempt collapses spectacularly when you pull the walls too thin. Your second attempt works until you try to collar the neck inward and the whole thing twists into an abstract sculpture. Attempt 3 actually produces something jar-shaped, though it's lumpy and asymmetric and would probably tip over if you looked at it wrong. Master William watches your struggle with the expression of someone observing a particularly slow-witted animal. You're fighting the clay. Let it rise. Guide it gently. This advice is simultaneously accurate and completely unhelpful because you are letting it rise and guiding it gently, and it's still doing whatever it wants rather than what you want. The disconnect between understanding a technique intellectually and executing it physically is the core frustration of craft learning. You know what you're supposed to do, your hands just haven't learned how to do it yet. By attempt 7, you've produced a storage jar that William deems saleable to someone with low standards. This is actually progress. Week 1, you couldn't have made anything saleable to anyone. Week 3, you're producing work that might survive market scrutiny from non-discerning customers. At this rate of improvement, you'll be producing genuinely good work in maybe 5 years, which aligns with the traditional apprenticeship timeline. Medieval skill development was measured in years because that's how long it actually took to train hands and muscles to work at master level. Historians still argue whether the 7-year apprenticeship term was based on actual skill development time or just a traditional number that guilds enforced to limit competition. The evidence suggests mostly the former. 7 years of daily practice genuinely did produce competent craftspeople in most trades. But the guilds definitely used the long term to control labor supply, ensuring that new masters entered the market slowly enough not to oversaturate it. Medieval economic regulation was surprisingly sophisticated in its anti-competitive practices. Lunch break brings news. There's been an outbreak of flux, dysentery, in the lower part of town near the river. Several people have died, including a potter from a competing workshop. Medieval disease outbreaks were regular occurrences that killed randomly and terrified everyone because nobody understood contagion. The flux was probably caused by contaminated water, but medieval people attributed it to bad air, divine punishment, or unfavorable planetary alignments. Master William responds practically, "Don't drink from the river downstream. Use the well water only. Wash your hands before eating." Medieval hygiene advice was hit or miss, but the hand-washing recommendation was actually sound even if the reasoning behind it was completely wrong. The afternoon brings glazing work. You're back to dipping pots in lead glaze, breathing fumes that are definitely poisoning you slowly. Your persistent headache has become such a constant companion that you barely notice it anymore. This is adaptation in its most depressing form. You've normalized brain damage as just part of the job. Medieval potters who worked with lead glaze for decades developed neurological symptoms, tremors, cognitive decline, mood disturbances that were just accepted as normal aging. Nobody connected the glaze exposure to the symptoms because the concept of chronic toxicity didn't exist yet. A quirky detail about medieval lead poisoning. The symptoms overlap significantly with being poor and overworked, which made them nearly impossible to identify as poisoning specifically. Fatigue? You're a laborer, of course you're tired. Cognitive difficulties? You're uneducated, nobody expects sharp thinking. Abdominal pain? Everyone's got digestive problems from the terrible diet. The lead poisoning hid inside the general misery of medieval lower-class existence, killing people slowly while remaining invisible as a specific cause. Between glaze dipping, Thomas shares his plans for when he finishes his apprenticeship. He wants to travel to London and work in the larger pottery workshops there, learn more advanced techniques, maybe save enough to eventually return and open his own shop. It's a reasonable plan that probably won't work out. Most journeymen never accumulated enough capital to become masters, and London was expensive and competitive. But the dream keeps him going through the daily grind, provides a narrative where this suffering has purpose and direction. Medieval people needed those narratives because without them, the pointlessness of the suffering became unbearable. You realize you've stopped thinking about your own future entirely. Not in a depressed way, just in a pragmatic acceptance that the future is too distant and uncertain to waste energy contemplating. Today requires all your attention. Tomorrow will require all your attention. Next week, next month, next year. Those are abstractions that don't help you center clay or tread mud or avoid breathing too much lead dust. Medieval people often had this truncated time horizon because their lives were precarious enough that long-term planning felt foolish. You lived in the present because the present was hard enough without borrowing anxiety from the future. Evening brings the task you've been dreading. Kiln repairs. That warped shelf from the last firing needs replacing, which means making a new kiln shelf from scratch. Kiln furniture is made from coarse clay mixed heavily with grog, up to 50% crushed pottery, to make it resistant to thermal shock. You're assigned to mixing duty, which means wedging coarse clay with ground pottery until your shoulders feel like they're separating from your body. The wedging motion for kiln furniture is more aggressive than for throwing clay because you're trying to forcibly integrate materials that don't naturally want to combine. After an hour of wedging, you've produced enough clay for a kiln shelf. Master William demonstrates how to form it, rolling out a thick slab, cutting it to size, letting it dry slowly on a flat board. The shelf won't be fired separately. It'll be fired during a regular kiln load and just left in the kiln permanently as part of the furniture. Medieval potters didn't waste kiln space or fuel on firing furniture separately. Everything was about efficiency because margins were so thin that waste meant the difference between surviving and failing. The kiln repair work continues as light fades. You're mixing clay for props, the cylindrical supports that hold up shelves. Thomas is preparing kiln wash to coat the shelf and protect it from glaze drips. Master William is examining the kiln walls for cracks that need patching. Medieval kilns required constant maintenance because the thermal cycling, heating to over 1,000 degrees then cooling back to ambient, stressed every component. A kiln might last 20 years with diligent care or fail after a few years if neglected. The difference was constant vigilance and repair work. By the time full darkness arrives, you're all exhausted and covered in coarse clay dust that makes your skin itch. The workshop is dim and cold except near the fire. Medieval evenings were long and boring because there wasn't much you could do in darkness beyond sleep or sit near the fire and talk. Entertainment was conversation, simple games, or nothing. You're too tired for conversation, so you just exist in the firelight, staring at nothing, letting your body rest before tomorrow's fresh hell begins. Master William surprises everyone by producing ale, actual ale, not the thin small ale everyone drinks daily. It's stronger, richer, with a yeasty flavor that's genuinely pleasant. He pours 3 cups and raises his in a toast. 3 weeks. You're still here. Most quit by now. This is apparently cause for celebration. You've survived the period where most new apprentices realize what they've gotten into and flee. Thomas grins and clinks cups. You drink and try to feel proud of surviving 3 weeks of torture, but mostly you just feel tired. The conversation turns to workshop stories, the oral tradition that preserves craft knowledge and provides entertainment. Master William tells about an apprentice 10 years ago who accidentally wedged a mouse into his clay. Didn't notice until the pot was on the wheel and the mouse suddenly squirted out the side. Thomas shares a story about a journeyman who got drunk and tried to throw pots blindfolded as a party trick, producing abstract disasters that somehow sold because the buyer thought they were intentionally artistic. You have nothing to contribute because 3 weeks isn't enough time to accumulate memorable disasters, though you've certainly produced enough unmemorable ones. The stories are funny in a dark medieval way, where the humor comes from suffering and failure rather than wit or cleverness. Medieval humor often centered on physical comedy, misfortune, and the humiliation of others. You're learning to laugh at disasters because the alternative is crying, and crying doesn't change anything. This emotional recalibration is perhaps the most significant transformation you've undergone. You're becoming medieval in your acceptance that life is hard, failure is common, and humor is found in darkness because darkness is all there is. As the evening winds down and Master William banks the fire for the night, you reflect on what you've learned about medieval pottery and about yourself. The work hasn't gotten easier, you've just gotten harder. Your body has transformed from soft modern comfort to functional medieval durability. Your expectations have recalibrated from work should be pleasant to work should be survivable. Your time horizon has collapsed from years to days because that's all you can meaningfully plan for. You've become, in 3 short weeks, a medieval person in all the ways that matter. Adapted to suffering, accepting of limits, focused on survival rather than flourishing. Would you last a day in a medieval pottery workshop? No. The first day would break you physically and psychologically. Would you last a week? Unlikely. Most people would quit when the reality set in. 3 weeks? You've somehow managed it, though managed is generous. You've endured barely by surrendering most of what made you modern and comfortable. 7 years of apprenticeship? That's not a journey toward mastery. It's a prison sentence served in clay and fire, where the reward for survival is the privilege of continuing the same work as a journeyman. The pottery you're making isn't beautiful. It's not artistic or creative in the romantic sense. It's functional objects produced through systematic suffering by people who had limited alternatives. The bowls will be used and broken. The jugs will crack and be discarded. The storage jars will eventually shatter. Nothing you're making will outlast you significantly. The work is, in many ways, pointless, endless production of temporary objects that get replaced when they fail, just like the apprentices who produced them. And yet medieval people did this work, generation after generation, because society needed pottery and someone had to make it. They found meaning not in the grandeur of the work, but in the small victories. A centered piece of clay, a pot that survived firing, a successful market day. They built lives around grinding repetition and found community in shared suffering. They passed on skills not because those skills were glorious, but because they were necessary and hard-won. You wouldn't last a day in a medieval pottery workshop because medieval life required a resilience that modern comfort has bred out of us. The physical toughness, the psychological acceptance of suffering, the ability to find satisfaction in mere survival. These are adaptations to a harsh world that we've thankfully left behind. Medieval craft work wasn't noble or romantic. It was brutal, damaging labor performed by tough people in terrible conditions because the alternative was starvation. 3 weeks in, you understand why medieval people looked old at 30 and died at 45. You understand why apprentices fled and why journeymen drank and why masters were perpetually grim. You understand that pottery wasn't a craft. It was a slow-motion disaster that paid just well enough to keep you trapped in its cycle of suffering. And you understand, finally and completely, that you would absolutely not survive a medieval pottery apprenticeship unless you were willing to surrender everything soft and comfortable about yourself and become someone harder, colder, and more capable of enduring. The good news is you'd never have to actually do this. Modern life, for all its flaws, doesn't require you to destroy your body making chamber pots for pennies while slowly being poisoned by lead glaze. The medieval world is safely in the past, and its brutal labor conditions are museum pieces we can observe from comfortable distance. But understanding what that world required, the toughness, the suffering, the grinding persistence, gives you perspective on how far we've come and how much we take for granted. So no, you wouldn't last a day in a medieval pottery workshop. But neither would most people, and that's okay. We've built a world where pottery comes from factories, where labor protections exist, where suffering isn't the price of employment. Medieval potters would probably think we're soft and spoiled. They'd be right, and we should be grateful for that softness, because it represents progress, the slow, hard-won movement away from brutality and toward dignity. Now the workshop is dark except for dying embers in the fire. Master William is already asleep in his house next door. Thomas is snoring in his corner, and you're lying in your straw pile, body aching, hands damaged, lungs full of clay dust, contemplating 7 more years of this that you definitely won't survive. Outside, medieval night presses against the workshop walls, dark, cold, and indifferent to your suffering. Tomorrow, more clay, more wheels, more fire, more pain. The cycle continues, endless and grinding, until your body fails or your spirit breaks or you somehow, impossibly, emerge 7 years later as a journeyman potter with skills you bought at too high a price. That's the medieval bargain. Trade your youth and health for functional competence in a profession that will continue destroying you for as long as you practice it. Welcome to medieval pottery. You came for history and romance. You got suffering and perspective instead. The lesson is clear. The past was harder than you imagine, medieval people were tougher than you appreciate, and modern comfort is a gift we should treasure because the alternative, demonstrated so thoroughly by your 3 weeks in a pottery workshop, is a kind of daily brutality that most of us simply couldn't endure. But before you drift completely off into sleep, let your breathing slow, let the weight of that medieval day settle and then lift away from your shoulders. The workshop fades, the smell of clay and smoke dissolves, and you're back in your own comfortable bed, your own soft pillow, your own safe time. The pottery will stop spinning. The fire dies down to nothing, and you're left with just the quiet, the dark, and the gentle reminder that you've survived another journey through history. Not by living it, but by imagining it, by understanding it, by respecting the toughness of the people who actually did endure what you could only visit for these few thousand words. They were remarkable, those medieval potters, not because they were heroes, but because they were humans who found ways to persist through conditions that would break us. Rest now. Tomorrow you'll wake up in a world with hot showers and coffee and labor laws, and that's exactly where you should be. Sleep well, traveler. The past is safely behind you, and the present is soft and warm and kind by comparison. And so, the workshop grows quiet now, doesn't it? The fire in the hearth settles to gentle embers, glowing soft orange in the darkness. Master William's breathing is steady from the house next door. Thomas has stopped snoring. Even the wind outside seems to be taking a rest, leaving everything still and peaceful. The clay is resting too, aging in its damp corner, becoming smoother and more workable while everyone sleeps. The pots on their drying shelves are slowly hardening, changing from soft clay to leather-hard ceramic, a transformation that happens so gradually you'd never notice it happening, but somehow, mysteriously, it happens anyway. Your body is heavy now, sinking deeper into rest, letting go of all that medieval hardship. Your hands unclench, your shoulders drop, your breathing matches the slow rhythm of the dying fire. In and out, steady and calm, like the wheel turning slowly, slowly, coming to a gentle stop. There's nothing more to prove tonight, no more clay to throw, no more work to finish. Just this soft, quiet darkness, wrapping around you like a warm blanket, better than any scratchy medieval wool. The pottery will be there tomorrow or not tomorrow or never. It doesn't matter now. What matters is this moment of complete rest, this surrender to sleep, this gentle drifting away from effort and into simple, peaceful nothingness. The workshop fades. The centuries fade. Even these words are fading now, growing softer, quieter, like a whisper that's almost too quiet to hear. Almost gone. Almost. Sleep now. Just sleep. Everything is exactly as it should be.